In the fog-shrouded depths of Devonshire, a grand manor hides a deadly secret. A scream pierces the night, and Lady Eleanor Blackthorne is found deadlocked in her study. A jeweled dagger in her heart, her will burned to ash. Who invited Hercule Poirot to this fateful gala, and why did they hint at a matter of utmost delicacy? Was it her indebted nephew, her secretive ward, the disgraced colonel, the nervous doctor, or the cryptic novelist weaving lies? A hidden passage, a poisoned sedative, and a shadowy figure at dusk twist the truth into knots. Can Poirot's little grey cells unravel a murder where every clue is a question and every answer a deception? In 30 seconds, step into Blackthorn Manor, where betrayal lurks behind every door, and the truth is more dangerous than the crime itself. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Manor. Rain had begun to fall in earnest as the train rattled through the Devonshire countryside, its wheels screeching against the tracks with a rhythm that Hercule Poirot found oddly soothing. He sat in his first-class compartment, his gloved hands resting lightly on the polished handle of his walking stick, his sharp eyes fixed on the blurred landscape beyond the window. The green hills, shrouded in mist, seemed to whisper secrets, and Poirot, ever attuned to the whispers of mystery, felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. In his pocket lay the letter that had summoned him here, its crisp parchment now slightly creased from repeated readings. The handwriting was elegant, precise, yet tinged with an urgency that intrigued him. Lady Eleanor Blackthorne, mistress of Blackthorn Manor, had requested his presence for a weekend gala at her isolated estate. The letter spoke of a matter of utmost delicacy, a phrase that, to Poirot, was as enticing as a perfectly brewed cup of tisane. She had not elaborated, but the vagueness was deliberate, he was certain. It was a bait, and Poirot was not one to resist such a lure. The train slowed, and Poirot adjusted his impeccably tailored coat, ensuring not a single speck of dust marred its surface. He stepped onto the platform at Blackthorn Halt, a desolate station where the wind howled like a mournful hound. A chauffeur in a dark uniform awaited him, holding a sign that read simply, M. Poirot. The man, broad-shouldered and taciturn, led him to a gleaming Rolls-Royce, its engine purring softly in the drizzle. The drive to Blackthorn Manor was silent, save for the patter of rain on the car's roof. Poirot observed the landscape with keen interest. Gnarled trees, their branches clawing at the sky, fields stretching into the fog, and, looming ahead, the silhouette of the manor itself. It was a Gothic monstrosity, all pointed arches and towering turrets, its stone fricade weathered by centuries of secrets. As the car crunched along the gravel drive, Poirot's mind catalogued every detail: the ivy creeping up the walls, the gargoyles leering from the eaves, the faint glow of lamplight in the upper windows. The butler, Jenkins, greeted him at the grand entrance, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Monsieur Poirot, welcome to Blackthorn Manor," he intoned, his voice as smooth as polished oak. "Lady Blackthorne awaits you in the drawing-room." Poirot followed Jenkins through a labyrinth of corridors, their walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow his every step. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, mingled with something less tangibly a faint undercurrent of unease. He noted the creak of the floorboards, the flicker of gas lamps casting long shadows, and the distant sound of laughter, sharp and brittle, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. The drawing-room was a study in opulence, crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a roaring fire that did little to dispel the chill in the air. Lady Eleanor Blackthorne stood by the hearth, a tall, regal woman in her late 50s, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her eyes, sharp as cut glass, assessed Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a hand adorned with a single emerald ring, "your reputation precedes you. I am grateful you accepted my invitation." Madame Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "Hercule Poirot is always at the service of those who seek the truth. Your letter, it was most intriguing." Eleanor's smile was tight, almost imperceptible. "I trust you will find the weekend illuminating. Allow me to introduce my guests." She gestured to the small assembly gathered around the room. First was Charles Blackthorne, her nephew, a handsome man in his 30s, with a careless charm that bordered on arrogance. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled, and his eyes darted restlessly, as if searching for an escape. Next was Sylvia Marlowe, Eleanor's ward, a vivacious young woman with auburn curls and a laugh that rang like silver bells, though her gaze held a flicker of something guarded. Colonel Reginald Hurst, retired, stood ramrod straight, his mustache bristling as he recounted a war story to no one in particular. Dr. Clara Fielding, a pale woman with nervous hands, hovered near a sideboard, clutching a glass of sherry. Finally, Victor Crane, a novelist of minor repute, lounged in an armchair, his sharp features and sly smile suggesting a man who saw more than he revealed. Dinner was announced, and the party moved to the dining room, where a long mahogany table gleamed under candlelight. The meal was exquisite roast pheasant, truffled potatoes, and a claret that Poirot pronounced Tours magnifique. But the conversation was strained. Charles spoke loudly of London's social scene, Sylvia flirted with the colonel, and Clara murmured vague responses, her eyes fixed on her plate. Victor Crane, however, watched Eleanor with an intensity that Poirot found curious, his pen scratching notes in a small leather-bound book. As the dessert course arrived, a delicate lemon soufflelana rose, her presence commanding silence. "My friends," she began, her voice steady, but laced with steel, "I have gathered you here, not merely for pleasure. Tomorrow, I intend to revise my will. Certain arrangements must be clarified." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Charles's fork clattered against his plate. Sylvia's smile faltered. Hurst cleared his throat loudly, and Clara's glass trembled in her hand. Crane's pen paused, his eyes narrowing. Poirot, sipping his coffee, observed each reaction, his mind already weaving a tapestry of motives. The evening drew to a close, and the guests dispersed to their rooms. Poirot lingered in the drawing-room, examining a portrait of late husband, Sir Henry Blackthorne, whose stern visage seemed to guard some unspoken truth. He was about to retire when a scream shattered the silence, high and piercing, echoing from the upper floors. Poirot moved swiftly, his small frame belying his agility, following Jenkins and the guests who converged on the source, Eleanor's private study. The door was locked, the key still in the lock from the inside. Jenkins, with Charles's help, forced it open, revealing a scene that froze them all. Eleanor lay slumped over her desk, her silk gown stained crimson. A jeweled dagger, its handle encrusted with sapphires, protruded from her chest. The room was sealed, windows latched, curtains undisturbed. Papers were scattered across the desk, but the will, if it had been there, was gone. Poirot knelt beside the body, his gloved fingers brushing the floor. He noted the faintest smudge of ash near the fireplace, the cold rigidity of Eleanor's hand, and a curious detail, a single rose petal, vivid red, caught in the hem of her gown. "Monsieur Poirot," Charles stammered, his face pale. "Is she dead?" Poirot confirmed, his voice calm but grave. "And not by accident. This, Mies, Amos, is murder." The guests gasped, their voices overlapping in shock and denial. Poirot raised a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the room. "The windows, they are locked. The door, it was locked from within. Yet a murderer has struck. Hercule Poirot will find them." He moved to the desk, his movements precise, almost theatrical. Beneath it, half hidden by the rug, he found a small brass key, its design different from the one in the door. He held it up, his mustache twitching slightly. "Curio," he murmured. "This key, it does not belong here. Someone has been careless." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their alibis and secrets already unraveling in Poirot's mind. He turned to Jenkins. "Summon the police, but do not disturb this room. The truth, it hides in the details." As the butler hurried away, Poirot's gaze lingered on the rose petal, its vibrant hue a stark contrast to the grim scene. The key, the petal, the missing willage, was a thread in a tapestry only he could weave. The game had begun, and Hercule Poirot was in his element. The manor seemed to hold its breath as the night deepened, the rain lashing against the windows like an impatient spectre. Poirot retired to his room, but sleep was far from his mind. He sat at a small writing desk, his notebook open, his pencil sketching a diagram of the study. The locked room intrigued him, a puzzle worthy of his little gray cells. The key he had found was not for the door, nor any lock in the study. It was an anomaly, a deliberate clue, or a careless mistake. He leaned toward the latter. Murderers, he knew, were rarely as clever as they believed. The rose petal, too, was significant. The manor's gardens were renowned, but Poirot had seen no roses in bloom during his arrival, not in this late autumn chill. Had it been brought from elsewhere, or was it a remnant of some earlier event? He made a note to inspect the greenhouse. In the morning, the guests' reactions replayed in his mind. Charles's pallor suggested guilt or fear, but his shock seemed genuine. Sylvia's tears were abundant, yet her eyes were dry grief or performance. Colonel Hurst's bluster had faltered, his hands trembling as he lit a cigar. Clara Fielding's nervous fidgeting betrayed more than simple anxiety, and Victor Crane's silence was too calculated. His novelist's mind perhaps scripting alibis. Poirot closed his notebook, his thoughts drifting to Eleanor's announcement about the will. It was the catalyst, the spark that ignited this crime. Whoever killed her knew the will's contents, feared them. The missing document was the key, but not the brass one in his pocket. That key, he suspected, opened something else entirely, a secret compartment, perhaps, or a hidden truth. He rose, adjusting his tie in the mirror. The manor was silent now, but its walls pulsed with secrets. Tomorrow, he would begin in earnest. The interviews, the searches, the careful prodding of fragile egos. For now, he allowed himself a small smile. The puzzle was complex. But Hercule Poirot had never met a mystery he could not unravel. The morning dawned gray and heavy, the mist thicker than the day before. Poirot joined the guests for breakfast, noting their strained politeness. Charles avoided his gaze, Sylvia toyed with her food, Hurst grumbled about the weather. Clara sipped tea with shaking hands, and Crane scribbled in his notebook, his eyes darting to Poirot, intermittently. After breakfast, Poirot requested a tour of the manor, ostensibly to appreciate its architecture. Jenkins obliged, leading him through grand halls and dusty wings, past locked doors and forgotten rooms. Poirot's eyes missed nothing: a scuff mark on a staircase, a curtain slightly askew, a faint smell of smoke lingering in a corridor. In the library, he paused, running his fingers along the shelves. A panel behind a row of leather-bound volumes felt hollow. He pressed it, and with a soft click, a section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Mon Dieu, Poirot murmured, his eyes gleaming. The passage led upward, its stone walls damp and cold. He followed it, emerging in a small alcove just outside Eleanor's study. The passage explained how the murderer entered a locked room, but not why. The key in his pocket, he realized, might belong to this very passage, a secondary lock, perhaps, to ensure privacy. Returning to the library, Poirot examined the books near the hidden panel. One, a worn volume of Shakespeare, was slightly misaligned. He opened it, finding a folded paper tucked inside, a draft of Eleanor's will, dated a month earlier. It named Sylvia as the primary beneficiary, with Charles receiving only a modest stipend. A codicil, however, hinted at a secret trust, its details obscured by cryptic phrasing. To the one who holds the shadow's key, Poirot's mind raced. The shadow's key, another metaphor, or a literal object. The will's draft confirmed the motive. Someone stood to lose everything. But the final will, the one Eleanor intended to revise, was still missing. Had it been burned, as the ash in the fireplace suggested? Or was it hidden elsewhere, waiting to be found? He returned to the drawing room, where the guests were gathered, their faces taut with suspicion. "Mise," Amos Poirot began, his voice soft but commanding. "The death of Lady Blackthorne is no simple crime. The locked room, the missing will, the key I have found, they are pieces of a puzzle. Hercule Poirot will solve it, but I require your cooperation." Charles shifted uncomfortably. "What key?" he demanded. Poirot held up the brass key, its surface glinting in the firelight. "This, monsieur, does not belong to the study door. It is a clue left by the murderer's carelessness, or perhaps their arrogance. Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Hurst's mustache twitched, and Clara's teacup rattled in its saucer. Crane, however, remained impassive, his pen scratching steadily. The police arrived shortly after. A local inspector named Hargreaves, who deferred to Poirot with grudging respect. A locked room murder, eh? Hargreaves said, scratching his chin. Tricky business. Tricky, oui, Poirot agreed, but not impossible. The truth, it is always within reach. As the inspector began his routine questions, Poirot slipped away to the greenhouse, a glass structure at the edge of the gardens. The air inside was humid, thick with the scent of earth and decay. He found no roses, only orchids and ferns, their leaves glistening in the dim light. But in a corner, half buried in a pot, he found a second clue. A torn piece of silk, the same shade as Sylvia's gown. It was no accident, he knew. Someone had placed it here, perhaps to implicate her, or to divert attention. Poirot pocketed the silk, his mind turning to the cryptic note from Eleanor's study. Beware the shadow at dusk. The phrase echoed in his thoughts, a warning or a clue. Dusk, the time of her death. The shadow, perhaps, the cloaked figure Jenkins had seen. But who was it, and why the theatricality? He returned to the manor, where the guests were now under Hargreaves's scrutiny. Poirot observed from a distance, noting Charles's evasive answers, Sylvia's nervous glances, Hurst's bluster, Clara's reticence, and Crane's calculated calm. Each was hiding something, but only one was a murderer. The day wore on, and Poirot continued his quiet investigation, piecing together fragments of truth. He found a smudged fingerprint on the fireplace poker in the study, too faint to identify, but distinct from the guests' prints, which Hargreaves had collected. He discovered a hidden compartment in Eleanor's desk, empty but bearing traces of wax, as if a sealed document had been stored there. And in the attic, among dusty trunks, he found a cloaked garment, its hem stained with mud from the chapel path. By evening, Poirot felt the puzzle taking shape. The murder was not impulsive, but meticulously planned. The locked room, the dagger, the missing will-all were designed to mislead. Yet the murderer had made mistakes. The key, the silk, the fingerprint. They were threads in a tapestry. Poirot was weaving, and soon he would reveal the pattern, as night fell. He joined the guests for dinner, their faces pale under the candlelight. The conversation was stilted, each word weighed with suspicion. Poirot ate sparingly, his mind elsewhere. The rose petal, the shadow at dusk, the secret passage, these were not random. They were signposts, leading him to the truth. After dinner, he excused himself, retiring to his room to review his notes. The brass key lay on his desk, its purpose still elusive. He traced its outline, his thoughts circling back to the will, the shadow, the petal. The answer was close, he could feel it, like a melody just out of reach. He stood, pacing the room, his little gray cells working furiously. The murderer had entered through the passage, poisoned Eleanor with a subtle toxin to ensure death, then staged the dagger to confuse the method. The will was burned to hide its contents, but the draft in the library suggested Sylvia's inheritance was the motive. Yet something nagged at Poirot, a detail he had overlooked, a thread he had not yet pulled. He paused, his eyes falling on the window, where the rain had stopped, leaving only the mist. In that moment, a spark ignited in his mind, the shadow. At dusk, the cloaked figure, the rose petal. They were not separate clues, but parts of a single narrative. A story the murderer had written to deceive. Poirot smiled, a small triumphant curve of his lips. Mon ami, he murmured to himself. You are clever, but not as clever as Hercule Poirot. He sat, his pencil flying across the page, outlining his next steps. Tomorrow, he would confront the guests, test their alibis, and lay a trap for the murderer. The key, he suspected, opened a lock not in the manor, but in the chapel, where Jenkins had seen the shadow. The petal, perhaps, was a symbol, a message from Eleanor herself. As he closed his notebook, Poirot felt a quiet satisfaction. The first piece of the puzzle was in place. The locked room was no longer a mystery, but a challenge, met. The murderer believed themselves untouchable. But they had not reckoned with the little Belgian detective whose mind was sharper than any dagger. He extinguished the lamp, the darkness enveloping him like a cloak. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Will. The morning after Lady Eleanor Blackthorn's murder broke over Blackthorn Manor, like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. The mist that clung to the Devonshire hills seemed to seep into the very walls of the Gothic estate, lending an oppressive weight to the air. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed, despite the grim circumstances, stood in the grand dining hall, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the gathered guests. The room, with its towering oak-paneled walls and heavy chandeliers, felt less like a place of warmth and more like a stage for secrets. Breakfast had been laid out, but the plates remained largely untouched, the clink of cutlery replaced by the uneasy murmur of suspicion. Poirot's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the previous night's chaos. Lady Eleanor's death in her locked study, the jeweled dagger plunged into her chest, the missing will, and the hidden key he had found beneath her desk. These were not mere details, but threads in a tapestry of deceit. The key, small and ornate, had been deliberately placed, he was certain, to suggest a clumsy attempt at staging a locked-room mystery. But Poirot was not so easily misled. The murderer, he reasoned, was someone who knew the manor intimately, someone who understood its secrets and sought to obscure their own. He turned his attention to the guests, each of whom sat with varying degrees of discomfort. Charles Blackthorn, Eleanor's nephew and presumed heir, lounged with an air of nonchalance that struck Poirot as forced. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled, as though he had slept in it, and his fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the table. Sylvia Marlowe, Eleanor's vivacious ward, dabbed at her eyes with a laced handkerchief, her sobs punctuated by glances at the others, as if gauging their reactions. Colonel Reginald Hurst, his military bearing still evident despite his retirement, sat rigidly, his jaw set as he stared into his untouched coffee. Dr. Clara Fielding, the nervous physician, fidgeted with her spectacles, her pale face betraying sleeplessness. And Victor Crane, the enigmatic novelist, scribbled in a small notebook, his expression unreadable behind a mask of intellectual detachment. "Mies Amos," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "We are gathered here not for pleasantries, but to confront a most heinous crime. Lady Eleanor Blackthorn was murdered last night, and the truth, it hides among us. I, Hercule Poirot, will uncover it, for the truth, it cannot remain in the shadows." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Charles raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Really, Monsieur Poirot, must we endure this theatricality? Surely it was a thief, caught in the act, who panicked and fled." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of his amusement at such a simplistic theory. A thief, Monsieur Blackthorn. And yet, nothing of value was taken save for the will, which is now but ashes in the fireplace. Nan, this was no random act. The murderer knew precisely what they sought. Sylvia let out a theatrical sob, drawing all eyes to her. Oh, poor Eleanor! Who could do such a thing? She was so kind, so generous. Her voice trembled, but Poirot noted the careful way her fingers clutched the handkerchief, as if it were a prop in a performance. "Kind, perhaps," Poirot said, his tone neutral, but also a woman of secrets. "The will, Mademoiselle Marlowe, what did it contain? You, as her ward, must have some knowledge." Sylvia's eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. I don't know. She never spoke of it to me. She only said she was changing. That it was time to set things right." "Set things right," Poirot repeated, his eyes narrowing. A curious phrase. "And you, Monsieur Blackthorn, as her heir, did you not expect to benefit?" Charles shrugged, his nonchalance now tinged with irritation. "I assumed I'd inherit, yes. But Eleanor was always changing her mind. She loved playing the puppet master, dangling promises over us all." Colonel Hurst cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "This is nonsense. The woman was stabbed in a locked room. If it wasn't a thief, then it's one of us, and I'll be damned if I sit here accused. without evidence. Evidence, Colonel, is precisely what I seek, Poirot replied, his gaze steady. And I assure you, it is here, waiting to be found by one who knows where to look. Dr. Fielding adjusted her spectacles nervously. Monsieur Poirot, surely. The police should handle this. I mean no offense, but this is a matter for professionals. Poirot's smile was polite but sharp. The police, Madame Fielding, they have their methods, but they lack the finesse of Poirot's little grey cells. Rest assured, I will uncover the truth before they arrive. Victor Crane closed his notebook with a snap, his voice low and measured. You seem very confident, Monsieur Poirot. But what if the truth is more complex than you imagine? Eleanor was a woman of many enemies, some not in this room. Poirot tilted his head, intrigued by Crane's cryptic tone. Then I shall find them, Monsieur Crane, whether they hide in this manor or beyond. With that, Poirot excused himself, his mind already turning to the study where Eleanor had met her end. The room was, as he had left it, sealed off by Jenkins. The butler, at Poirot's insistence, the heavy oak door, locked from the inside, had been forced open by the staff after the scream. The windows too were bolted shut, their iron frames unyielding. The jeweled dagger, still embedded in Eleanor's chest when Poirot first saw her, had been removed by the local coroner, but its image lingered in his theatrical touch, meant to distract. He knelt by the fireplace, where the scorched fragments of paper lay scattered. Using a pair of tweezers, he carefully collected the remnants, noting their charred edges. The will, he was certain, had been burned deliberately, but not entirely destroyed. Among the ashes, he found a fragment with the words "to my beloved" and a partial signature. Eleanor's unmistakable flourish. The rest was illegible, but the phrase suggested a personal bequest, perhaps to Sylvia or another unknown beneficiary. Poirot's attention shifted to the fireplace poker, lying innocently against the hearth. He had noticed it the previous night, its handle smudged with a fingerprint that matched none of the guests, a curious anomaly. He examined it again, confirming the smudge was deliberate, as if someone had tried to obscure their mark. The murderer is clever, he murmured, but not cleverer than Poirot. He moved to Eleanor's desk, a massive mahogany affair cluttered with papers, a quill pen, and an inkwell. Among the documents, he found a cryptic note in Eleanor's elegant script, "Beware the shadow at dusk." The words sent a shiver through him, not of fear, but of recognition. Dusk was the time of her death, according to Jenkins, who had heard the scream at precisely 6:47 p.m., as the sun dipped below the horizon. The note suggested Eleanor knew she was in danger, but from whom? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Jenkins entered, his face pale but composed. "Monsieur Poirot, you asked to see me." "Oui, Jenkins," Poirot said, gesturing to a chair. "You are the eyes and ears of this manor. Tell me, what did you see last night, before the tragedy?" Jenkins hesitated, his hands clasped tightly. "I was in the hall, preparing for the evening service. I saw no one near the study, except—" He paused, his brow furrowing. There was a figure, cloaked and hooded, moving toward the west wing. I thought it odd, but I assumed it was a guest seeking privacy. "A cloaked figure," Poirot repeated, his eyes gleaming. "And where, precisely, did this figure go?" "The old chapel, sir," Jenkins said. "It's rarely used now, but Lady Eleanor sometimes went there to think." Poirot nodded, dismissing Jenkins with a wave. The chapel, he decided, warranted investigation, but first, he needed to test the guests' alibis. He summoned them one by one to the drawing room, where he had set up a makeshift interrogation space. Charles was first, his casual demeanor now tinged with unease. "You were in the billiard room, Monsieur Blackthorne, oui?" Poirot asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Yes, with Hurst," Charles replied, lighting a cigarette. "We played a few rounds until the scream, and you saw no one else?" "Not a soul," Charles said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Why do you ask?" Poirot smiled, revealing nothing. "Merely to understand, monsieur. The truth, it is like a billiard game. Each shot reveals a new angle." Sylvia was next, her eyes red but dry. "I was in the library," she said, her voice trembling. "I was reading, trying to distract myself from Eleanor's announcement about the will. It upset me. And you heard nothing, saw nothing?" Poirot pressed. She shook her head, but Poirot noted the way her fingers twisted the hem of her dress. "Nothing," she whispered. Colonel Hurst was gruff, his answers clipped. "I was on the terrace, smoking." Jenkins can confirm Attai spoke to him briefly. Dr. Fielding claimed to have been in her room, nursing a headache, while Crane insisted he was writing in his quarters, a claim supported by the fresh ink on his fingers. Yet Poirot sensed gaps in their stories, moments unaccounted for in the crucial minutes before the scream. To test their alibis, Poirot orchestrated a reenactment, asking each guest to retrace their steps from 6:30 to 6:47 p.m. He timed their movements with a pocket watch, noting discrepancies. Charles's journey from the billiard room to the upstairs corridor took less time than he claimed, suggesting he could have reached the study unnoticed. Sylvia's path through the library placed her near the hidden passage Poirot had discovered, a fact she failed to mention. Hurst's terrace alibi held, but his proximity to the West Wing raised questions. Fielding and Crane's accounts were vaguer, their solitary activities harder to verify. As the reenactment concluded, Poirot returned to the study, his mind buzzing. The hidden passage, accessible via a spring-loaded bookshelf in the library, was a revelation. It explained how the murderer had entered and exited the locked room, bypassing the bolted door and windows. But who had used it, and why destroy the... Willie examined the passage's entrance, finding a torn silk thread caught in the bookshelf's hinge. It was pale blue, matching the gown Sylvia had worn the previous night. Confronting her later, Poirot held up the thread, his eyes piercing. "Mademoiselle Marlowe, this was found where the passage opens. Care to explain?" Sylvia's face drained of color. I was in the library, yes, but I didn't use the passage. I swear, I only touched the bookshelf while looking for a book." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "We shall see, mademoiselle. The truth, it is like a thread, it unravels with time." As the day waned, Poirot sat in the library, the manor's silence pressing against him. The fingerprint on the poker, the burned will, the cryptic note, the hidden passage. The silk thread all pointed to a murderer who was both bold and meticulous. But one detail gnawed at him, the fingerprint that matched no one. Was there another player in this deadly game, someone hiding in plain sight? He rose, determined to visit the chapel before nightfall. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. The shadow at dusk, he mused, was not just a warning, it was a clue to the killer's identity. And Poirot would not rest until he had unmasked them. Chapter 3. The Alibi Puzzled. The morning after Lady Eleanor Blackthorne's murder broke over Blackthorne Manor, like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. The mist that clung to the Devonshire hills seemed to seep into the very walls, casting a pallor over the grand dining room where Hercule Poirot gathered the guests. The chandeliers gleaming with crystal did little to dispel the gloom. Breakfast was a somber affair, with the clink of porcelain and the rustle of napkins punctuating an uneasy silence. Poirot, immaculate in his tailored suit, his mustache perfectly waxed, sat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the assembled company. Each face betrayed a flicker of Uni's guilt, fear, or perhaps merely the discomfort of being under the scrutiny of the world's greatest detective. Poirot sipped his tisane, the delicate aroma of chamomile a stark contrast to the grim task. "At hand, Mies, Amos," he began, his voice soft yet commanding. "We are confronted with a puzzle most intricate. Lady Eleanor was murdered in a locked room, her will destroyed, and yet the truth lies not in the locks or the ashes, but in the hearts of those present. I require your movements last evening, precise to the minute, for it is in the alibis that we shall find the crack in the facade of innocence." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Charles Blackthorne, Eleanor's nephew, leaned back in his chair, his angular face betraying a hint of defiance. Sylvia Marlowe, Eleanor's ward, clutched her teacup, her knuckles white. Colonel Reginald Hurst, his military bearing stiff as ever, puffed out his chest, while Dr. Clara Fielding's fingers trembled as she adjusted her spectacles. Victor Crane, the novelist, scribbled in a small notebook, his expression unreadable. The butler, Jenkins, hovered at the room's edge, his eyes darting nervously. "Let us begin," Poirot said, gesturing to Charles. "Monsieur Blackthorne, where were you when the scream was heard at approximately 9:30?" Charles cleared his throat, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding Poirot's. "I was in the billiard room, playing a solitary game. The door was open, and I heard the scream. I ran upstairs immediately, arriving just as Jenkins broke down the study door." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A solitary game, you say? And no one can confirm this?" Charles's jaw tightened. "The servants were busy. I suppose I was alone." "Very well," Poirot said, turning to Sylvia. "Mademoiselle Marlowe." Sylvia's voice quavered, her wide blue eyes brimming with tears. "I was in the library, reading. I heard the scream and rushed out, meeting Charles in the hall. We reached the study together." Poirot nodded, his fingers steepled. "And you, Colonel Hurst?" Hurst's mustache twitched. "On the terrace, smoking my evening cigar. I heard the commotion and came inside, finding the others at the study door." Dr. Fielding spoke next, her voice low. "I was in my room, tending to a headache. I took a sedative and was resting when the scream woke me. I joined the others." Shortly after, Victor Crane closed his notebook with a snap. "I was in my room, writing. The scream startled me, and I arrived at the study just as Jenkins forced the door." Poirot's gaze lingered on each face, as if peeling back layers of deceit. "Merci now. Let us test these alibis, for the truth is like a diamond flawed when viewed from the wrong angle." The morning passed in a meticulous reconstruction of the night's events. Poirot, with the precision of a watchmaker, led the group through the manor, timing their movements. The billiard room, where Charles claimed to be, was on the ground floor, a short walk from the main staircase. Poirot paced the distance, stopwatch in hand, noting it took precisely 42 seconds to reach the study. Charles's claim of arriving immediately raised Poirot's eyebrow. "Monsieur, your speed suggests either remarkable athleticism or proximity to the scene." Charles flushed. "I'm quick on my feet." The library, Sylvia's refuge, was a cavernous room lined with leather-bound tomes. Poirot examined the book she claimed to have read, a volume of Keats' Finding. It opened to a random page, the bookmark untouched. "Mademoiselle, you are a swift reader, Nan. Or perhaps the book was merely a prop." Sylvia's cheeks reddened. "I was distracted. The poetry soothed me." The terrace, where Colonel Hurst smoked, offered a clear view of the manor's west wing, including the study's windows. Poirot noted the cigar ash scattered on the flagstones, confirming Hurst's presence, but the timing puzzled him. "The scream," Jenkins confirmed, "came at 9:32 p.m., yet Hurst claimed to arrive after the others." "Colonel, the terrace is but a stone's throw from the hall. Why the delay?" Hurst bristled. "I'm not as spry as I once was. Took me a moment to stub out my cigar." Dr. Fielding's room was on the second floor, far from the study. Tested her claim, walking briskly from her room to the study, clocking it at 1 minute and 18 seconds. Her sedative story held, but her nervous demeanor suggested more. "Madame, your headache, did it perhaps conceal another purpose?" Clara's eyes widened. "I'm a doctor, not a liar. I was unwell." Victor Crane's room was closest to the study, a mere 20 seconds walk. His typewriter sat silent, a half-written page in its carriage. Poirot read the text, a florid description of a murder eerily similar to Eleanor's. "Monsieur Crane, your imagination is prescient," Crane smirked. "A writer observes life. Coincidence, nothing more." As the group dispersed for luncheon, Poirot lingered in the hall, his mind a whirl of details. The alibis, while plausible, were like a tapestry with loose threads. Jenkins, ever attentive, approached. "Sir, there's something I must tell you. At dusk, before the scream, I saw a figure in a hooded cloak near the study window. I couldn't see their face." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Dusk, you say? The hour mentioned in Madame Blackthorne's note. This figure, where did they go?" "The chapel, sir. I didn't follow, too shaken." Poirot dismissed Jenkins with a nod, his mind racing. The cloaked figure was a new piece in the puzzle, but it was the manor itself that held secrets. He returned to the study, its heavy oak door now repaired after Jenkins's forced entry. The room was as he'd left it, Eleanor's body removed. The jeweled dagger confiscated by the local police, but the air still thick with the scent of her perfume. Poirot knelt by the fireplace, where the scorched fragments of the will had been found. Using a pair of tweezers, he extracted a tiny scrap missed earlier, bearing the word heir. It confirmed his suspicion. The will's destruction was no accident. His attention turned to the bookshelves, their dark wood gleaming in the dim light. Poirot ran his fingers along the spines, pausing at a volume of Shakespeare slightly askew. With a gentle tug, the shelf clicked, revealing a narrow passage behind it. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light as Poirot peered inside. The passage led upward, likely to the study's ceiling or an adjacent room. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "The locked room is not so locked." He followed the passage, emerging in a small attic above the study. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, but fresh footprints marked the dusty floor. The passage connected to the library, explaining how someone could enter the study unseen. Poirot's mind flashed to Sylvia, her silk gown torn, her alibi tied to the library, but the footprints were large, suggesting a man's boots, Charles Crane, or someone else entirely. Back in the study, Poirot examined the windows again. Sealed tight, their latches rusted, they offered no entry. Yet Jenkins's cloaked figure nagged at him. He stepped outside, circling the manor to the study's exterior wall. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, beneath the window, was a faint impression of boot heel, partially obscured by leaves. It matched the attic footprints. Someone had been outside, perhaps watching, perhaps planning. Returning indoors, Poirot summoned Jenkins. This cloaked figure described the cloak, dark, sir, perhaps black or navy. It billowed, like it was caught in the wind, and the height. "Tall, sir, taller than me, I'd wager." Jenkins stood just over 6 feet. Poirot filed this away, his mind turning to Colonel Hurst, the tallest guest, and Victor Crane, whose lanky frame was close behind. Charles, though athletic, was shorter. Sylvia and Clara were unlikely candidates for the figure's stature. As evening approached, Poirot gathered the guests in the drawing room, a fire crackling in the hearth. "Mes amis, the alibis you provide are like a house of cards until one card slips. Monsieur Blackthorne, your billiard game leaves you unaccounted for at a critical moment. Mademoiselle Marlowe, your poetry reading lacks conviction. Colonel Hurst, your cigar ash confirms your presence, but not your timing. Madame Fielding, your sedative is innocent, yet your nerves betray you. And Monsieur Crane, your writing mirrors the crime too closely for comfort." The guests protested, their voices overlapping. Poirot raised a hand. "Silence, s'il vous plaît. There is more. A hidden passage connects the library to the study, bypassing the locked door. And a cloaked figure, seen at dusk, suggests an observer or a conspirator. We are not yet at the truth, but we are close." He dismissed them, noting their reactions. Charles's defiance hardened. Sylvia's tears dried, replaced by a steely gaze. Hurst's mustache twitched with indignation. Clara's hand shook as she left. Crane's smirk faded, his eyes darting to the door. Alone, Poirot paced the drawing room, his little gray cells at work. The passage was key. It explained the locked room, but the cloaked figure and the burned will pointed to a deeper motive. Someone had planned this murder meticulously. Yet the theatrical dagger suggested a moment of panic or improvisation. The fingerprint on the fireplace poker, smudged and untraceable, was another clue. Was it a deliberate misdirection or a mistake? As night fell, Poirot stood by the window, gazing at the chapel in the distance. Jenkins's sighting of the cloaked figure, there was no coincidence. The note, "Beware." The shadow at dusk was a warning, but from whom, and to whom? The answer lay in the manor's secrets, and Poirot was determined to unravel them. He retired to his room, but sleep eluded him. Instead, he sketched a timeline, mapping each guest's movements against Jenkins's account. Charles's billiard, Room alibi was the weakest, his proximity to the stairs too convenient. Sylvia's torn silk thread placed her near the passage, but her delicate frame didn't match the cloaked figure. Hurst's terrace story held, but his delay was suspicious. Clara's sedative linked to the poison, yet her fear seemed genuine. Crane's typewriter and memoir knowledge made him a master of deception, but was he a murderer? The clock struck midnight, and Poirot paused, his pen hovering over the page. A faint creak echoed from the hall. Slipping silently to the door, he peered out, catching a glimpse of a shadow moving toward the library. He followed, his steps light, his senses alert. The library was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight. A figure hooded, tall stood by the bookshelf, reaching for the hidden passage. Poirot stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Bonsoir. It is a late hour for a stroll, Nan." The figure froze, then fled, vanishing into the passage. Poirot gave chase, but the attic was empty by the time he reached it. A single clue remained, scrap of paper, dropped in haste, bearing the words, "VC, payment due." Victor Crane's initials, again. The night's discovery, solidified Poirot's resolve. The alibis were a puzzle, but the pieces were falling into place. The hidden passage, the cloaked figure. The burned will all pointed to a murderer who knew Blackthorn Manor's secrets intimately. Tomorrow, he would confront the guests with this new evidence, forcing the truth into the open dot as he returned. To his room, Poirot smiled faintly. "The little grey cells, they do not fail me," he murmured. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot was one step closer to unmasking a killer. Chapter 4. The shadow at dusk. The mist clung to Blackthorn Manor, like a conspirator, veiling its secrets as Hercule Poirot stood in the grand hall, his sharp eyes scanning the intricate woodwork of the staircase. The cryptic note found in Lady Eleanor Blackthorn's study, "Beware the shadow at dusk," had lodged itself in his mind. A riddle, demanding resolution. The phrase was not mere melodrama. It was a clue, deliberate and precise, left by a woman who knew her life was in peril. Poirot's mustache twitched as he considered the timing. Eleanor had been murdered at dusk, her body discovered just as the sun dipped below the Devonshire hills. The shadow could be a figure lurking in the fading light, or, metaphorical, a betrayer among her circle. Either way, it was a thread he intended to pull until the tapestry of the crime unraveled. The morning after the discovery of the scorched will fragments, the manor buzzed with unease. The guests, summoned to the drawing room for breakfast, exchanged guarded glances over porcelain teacups and silver platters of scones. Charles Blackthorn, Eleanor's nephew, slouched in a high-backed chair, his tie askew, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting an escape. Sylvia, the vivacious ward, clutched a handkerchief, her delicate features pale but composed, her grief less theatrical than the night before. Colonel Reginald Hurst, his military bearing intact, sliced his bacon with surgical precision, though his jaw tightened at every creak of the old house. Dr. Clara Fielding, her hands trembling slightly, sipped tea in silence, her medical bag conspicuously absent. Victor Crane, the novelist, scribbled in a leather-bound notebook, his pen moving with a rhythm that suggested distraction rather than inspiration. The butler, Jenkins, hovered at the edges, his lined face betraying nothing but the faintest flicker of unease. Poirot, seated at the head of the table at Sylvia's insistence, observed them all. "Mies, Amos," he began, his voice calm, yet commanding. "The death of Lady Eleanor was no accident, nor was it the work of an outsider. The locked study, the hidden key, the burned will, these are the marks of a mind both cunning and desperate. I ask you now to consider. What did you see at dusk, the hour of her demise?" Silence fell, heavy as the fog outside. Charles coughed, adjusting his cufflinks. "I told you, Poirot, I was in the billiard room. Smoked a cigar, played a round. Alone, no one was with me, but I heard nothing unusual." Sylvia's voice was soft but steady. "I was in the library, reading. I didn't leave until I heard the scream. The windows were open-eyed. Have noticed anyone passing by?" Colonel Hurst set down his knife with a clink. "I was on the terrace. as I said, smoking my pipe, watching the sunset. Saw no one, heard nothing until that blasted scream. Dr. Fielding's cup rattled against its saucer. I was in my room, resting. A headache, you see. I didn't go near the study. Victor Crane closed his notebook with a snap. I was writing in my room. Poirot the Muse doesn't wait, you know. I heard the scream and came running, like the others. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Their alibis, rehearsed and polished, were too neat, like a row of dominoes waiting to be toppled. He turned to Jenkins, who stood by the sideboard, polishing a silver tray with unnecessary vigor. And you, Monsieur Jenkins. You mentioned a figure in a hooded cloak near the study at dusk. Tell me more. Jenkins hesitated, his cloth pausing mid-swipe. It was just a glimpse, sir. I was carrying linens to the guest wing when I saw someone tall, cloaked, moving quickly toward the old chapel. It was near dusk, maybe 6. I thought it odd. But Lady Eleanor often had visitors who preferred discretion. The chapel, Poirot murmured, his fingers steepled. And this figure, you saw them before? Jenkins nodded reluctantly. Twice, sir, in the past week. Always at dusk, always near the chapel. I never got a clear look at their face. Poirot rose, his movements deliberate. Merci, Jenkins. You have all given me much to consider. I shall inspect this chapel. Perhaps the shadow at dusk will reveal itself. The old chapel, a crumbling stone structure at the edge of the manor's grounds, stood half swallowed by ivy. Its arched windows, streaked with grime, admitted little light, and the air inside was damp, smelling of earth and neglect. Poirot, accompanied by Captain Hastings, who had arrived that morning at Poirot's urgent summons, stepped carefully over the uneven flagstones. Hastings, ever the loyal friend, carried a lantern, its beam dancing across faded frescoes, and a weathered altar. Poirot. This place gives me the creeps, Hastings said, his voice echoing faintly. What are we looking for? A connection, mon ami, Poirot replied, his eyes scanning the pews. The chapel is no mere backdrop. It is mentioned in Jenkins's account, and the note speaks of a shadow at dusk. This is where secrets linger. Near the altar, Poirot's keen gaze caught a glint of metal. He knelt, retrieving a cufflink, engraved with the initials R.H. Reginald Hurst, curio, he murmured, slipping it into his pocket. The colonel claimed to be on the terrace, yet his cufflink finds itself here. Hastings frowned. Could he be the cloaked figure? But why the chapel? Poirot did not answer immediately. He moved to a dusty bookshelf in the corner, its shelves sagging under the weight of old hymnals and ledgers. One ledger, bound in cracked leather, caught his attention. He opened it, revealing meticulous records of payments from Eleanor to Anne, unknown V.C. Sums of £50, paid monthly for the past year. The initials matched Victor Crane, the novelist. V.C. Poirot said softly, Monsieur Crane has some explaining to do. They returned to the manor, where Poirot summoned Crane to the library. The novelist, his dark hair slightly disheveled, entered with a guarded smile. Poirot, you've been poking about, haven't you? Found something juicy. Poirot held up the ledger. This, Monsieur Crane, records payments from Lady Eleanor. 2. VCU admitted she paid you to research her family's history. But these sums, £50 a month, are substantial for mere research. What was the true nature of your work? Crane's smile faltered. It was, as I said. Eleanor wanted a memoir, a history of the Blackthorne family. I dug through archives, old letters, even some unsavory bits about their business dealings. She paid well to keep me motivated. And did this research uncover anything she wished to keep hidden? Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. Crane hesitated. There were rumors. The Blackthornes made their fortune in trade, but not all of it was above board. Eleanor didn't want that in the memoir. I respected her wishes. Poirot produced the cufflink. And this, found in the chapel, does it belong to you? Crane shook his head. Not mine. I don't wear cufflinks, too fussy. Yet someone was in that chapel, Poirot pressed. A cloaked figure, seen at dusk. You were writing, you say. But can anyone confirm this? Crane's jaw tightened. No, I work alone. But But I wasn't skulking about in cloaks, if that's what you're implying. Poirot dismissed him with a wave, his mind already turning to the next thread. The chapel held more secrets, he was certain. That afternoon, he returned alone, his small flashlight illuminating the shadowed corners. Behind the altar, he noticed a faint seam in the stonework. Pressing it, he heard a soft click, and a narrow panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small glass vial, stoppered tightly, containing a colorless liquid. Poirot's nose wrinkled as he detected a faint, bitter odor poison, likely an alkaloid. Though he would need Dr. Fielding's expertise to confirm it. He pocketed the vial and closed the compartment, his mind racing. The poison suggested a second method of murder, one abandoned in favor of the jeweled dagger. Why? Was the dagger a flourish, meant to mislead? Or had the killer been interrupted before administering the poison? The cufflink pointed to Hurst. The payments to Crane, but the cloaked figure remained elusive. A shadow slipping through his grasp, back at the manor. Poirot sought out Dr. Fielding. She was in the conservatory, tending to a wilting orchid, her hands steadier than at breakfast. Dr. Poirot said, holding up the vial. I require your expertise. This was found in the chapel. What is it? Clara's eyes widened. It looks like a medicinal vial, but I'd need to test it. It could be anything, morphine, or something more dangerous, such as an alkaloid. Poirot asked, watching her closely. She paled. Possibly. I'd need my equipment to be sure. But Poirot, I swear. I do not accuse you, Dr. Poirot said gently. But someone with medical knowledge may have placed this here. Tell me, did Lady Eleanor ever mention a threat, someone she feared? Clara shook her head. She was anxious, but she never named anyone. She only said she felt watched, especially at dusk. Poirot nodded, filing away her words. The shadow at dusk was no mere metaphor, it was a person, a presence that had stalked Eleanor in her final days. The vial, the cufflink, the payments to Crane were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. As he left the conservatory, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. Poirot paused, his gaze fixed on the chapel in the distance. The shadow at dusk had left its mark, and he was determined to find it. The evening brought no new revelations, but the tension in the manor was palpable. At dinner, the guests ate in near silence, their eyes flickering to Poirot, as if expecting him to unveil the killer, then and there. He did not. Instead, he watched, noting the way Charles avoided Sylvia's gaze, the way Hurst's hand lingered near his pocket, the way Crane's pen never left his hand. Dr. Fielding excused herself early, claiming fatigue, but Poirot saw the fear in her eyes. As the clock struck 9, Poirot retired to his room, but sleep was far from his mind. He sat at the small desk, spreading out his notes. The hidden key, the burned will, the smudged fingerprint, the hidden passage, the cufflink, the vial, the payments to VC. Each clue was a thread, and the shadow at dusk was the knot that bound them. He closed his eyes, letting his little gray cells work, piecing together the fragments of motive and opportunity. The cufflink implicated Hurst, but his alibi, corroborated by Jenkins's sighting of him on the terrace, was solid. Crane's payments suggested blackmail or a deeper conspiracy, but his writing alibi, while unverified, was plausible. The vial pointed to a medical mind, perhaps Fielding, yet her fear seemed genuine. Charles's debts and Sylvia's torn silk thread lingered in his thoughts, but neither felt like the key. The cloaked figure, seen repeatedly at dusk, was the linchpin. Whoever they were, they had planned Eleanor's death with precision, only to leave a trail of clues that Poirot was now following. He opened his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. The shadow at dusk was no phantom, it was a person, fallible and human, who had made mistakes. The vial was one such mistake, hidden, but not destroyed, a sign of hesitation or interruption. Poirot rose, his resolve hardened. Tomorrow, he would confront Hurst about the cufflink and press Crane on the memoir's secrets. The chapel, he sensed, held more answers, and he would return at dusk, the hour when shadows revealed themselves. As he extinguished his lamp, the Manor settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. The shadow at dusk was close, and Hercule Poirot was closer still. "Should halves are of no use to us now," Poirot interrupted gently. "But this information is valuable. Dizziness, trembling, these are consistent with the early effects of an alkaloid. The murderer, it seems, tested their method before. The fatal dose." Poirot paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind clearly turning over the puzzle. The guests watched him, their expressions a mix of fear, suspicion, and fascination. Sylvia clutched her shawl tightly, while Victor Crane's fingers tapped nervously on his knee. Colonel Hurst's face was unreadable, but his eyes followed Poirot's every move. "There is another matter," Poirot said, stopping abruptly. "The prescription for the sedative, where is it?" Clara frowned, confused. "I wrote it myself, and gave it to Lady Eleanor. It should be in her desk, or perhaps the study." Poirot moved to the writing desk, sifting through papers with meticulous care. He paused, extracting a small slip of paper. "This, I presume?" he asked, holding it up. Clara nodded, but as Poirot examined the paper, his brow furrowed. "This is most irregular," he said. "The handwriting is precise, but the ink, it is not consistent with the pen on this desk. And the signature is yours, Dr. Fielding, but the flourish is slightly off. A forgery, perhaps." Clara gasped, rising to her feet. "A forgery? But who would?" "Who indeed?" Poirot said, his voice low. "Someone with access to your bag, your prescriptions, and a knowledge of your habits. Someone who wished to cast suspicion upon you, Dr. Fielding, while concealing their own guilt." He turned to the group, his eyes sweeping over each face. "Mies, Amos, we are dealing with a murderer of great intelligence. They have woven a web of deception, using the tools of medicine to obscure their crime. But Hercule Poirot will unravel this web, thread by thread." He slipped the forged prescription into his pocket, his expression unreadable. "For now, we return to the drawing room. I have much to consider, and there are other threads to pursue. Dr. Fielding, you will remain under my observation, but I am inclined to believe you are not the villain of this tale." Clara exhaled, her relief palpable, but the other guests exchanged uneasy glances. As they filed out of the room, Poirot lingered, his gaze returning to the sedative bottle. He knew the poison was the key, but the question remained: who had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the motive to wield it? The day passed in a blur of interviews and observations. Poirot moved through the manor like a shadow, his questions sharp and his deductions relentless. He spoke with Jenkins about the household routines, learning that Clara's medical bag was often left unattended in her room during meals. He examined the hidden passage again, noting its proximity to the library, where Sylvia had claimed to be reading. He even tested Colonel Hurst's alibi further, confirming the cigar ash on the terrace was fresh, ruling him out as the cloaked figure. By evening, Poirot had gathered enough to form a hypothesis, but he needed one final piece of evidence. He requested the guests assemble in the library, where he planned to test a theory. As they gathered, the tension was palpably tersen, aware that Poirot was closing in on the truth. "Madame et messieurs," Poirot began, standing before the towering bookshelves, "we have uncovered much today. But one question remains. Who forged the prescription that allowed the poison to enter Lady Eleanor's system? I have a small experiment to conduct." He produced a blank sheet of paper and a pen, placing them on the table. "Each of you will write a simple sentence for me. I was in the library at dusk, nothing more. I wish to compare your handwriting to the prescription." One by one, the guests complied, their expressions ranging from reluctance to outright fear. Poirot collected the samples, his eyes scanning each with meticulous care. When he reached Clara's, he paused, then held it alongside the forged prescription. "As I suspected," he said, his voice triumphant. "The forgery is clever, but not perfect. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen, these are unique to each hand, and this prescription does not match Dr. Fielding's writing." He turned to the group, his gaze piercing. "Someone in this room has gone to great lengths to frame Dr. Fielding, but they have underestimated Hercule Poirot. The poison, the dagger, the hidden passage, these are all pieces of a puzzle, and I am very close to seeing the whole picture." The guests sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting to one another. Poirot folded the papers carefully, tucking them into his pocket. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said. "For now, I suggest you all retire and lock your doors." As the group dispersed, Poirot remained in the library, his mind racing. The forged prescription was a breakthrough, but it pointed to a deeper truth. The murderer was not only cunning, but intimately familiar with the household's routines. The answer, he knew, lay in the connections between the guests' connections he had yet to fully unravel. He moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening moors. The shadow at dusk, the cloaked figure, the burned willow, were threads in a tapestry of deceit. But Poirot's little grey cells were at work, and he was determined to bring the truth to light. The night passed without incident, but the manor remained a house of secrets, its walls whispering of betrayal and murder. Poirot retired to his room, his notebook filled with observations, his mind piecing together the final clues. Tomorrow, he would pursue the next thread. Charles Blackthorne's financial troubles, and the mysterious telegram that hinted at a deeper conspiracy. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Dr. Clara Fielding was not the murderer, but her carelessness had been exploited by a master manipulator. The forged prescription was a stroke of brilliance, but it was also a mistake, one that would lead Poirot to the killer's door. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Secret. The morning sun filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of Blackthorne Manor, casting long, wavering shadows across the oak-paneled dining room. Hercule Poirot sat at the head of the table, his small, precise hands folded neatly before him, his mustache immaculately trimmed, and his sharp green eyes scanning the assembled guests. The air was thick with unease, the clink of porcelain cups the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Eleanor Blackthorne's murder the previous night had left the household in a state of suspended dread, and Poirot's presence, calm, methodical, and unyielding, only heightened the tension. Each guest knew that the little Belgian detective was not merely observing, he was dissecting their every word, gesture, and glance. Dr. Clara Fielding, seated at the far end of the table, was the object of Poirot's particular attention this morning. Her pale, angular face was drawn, her fingers fidgeting with the handle of her teacup. She had barely touched her breakfast, and her eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though expecting some unseen calamity to burst through. Poirot had noted her unease from the moment he arrived at Blackthorne Manor. But now, after the discoveries in the chapel and the cryptic clues surrounding Eleanor's death, Clara's behavior demanded closer scrutiny. "Dr. Fielding," Poirot began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "you have been most quiet this morning. Perhaps the events of last night weigh heavily upon you, Nan." Clara's hand trembled, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "It's a terrible thing, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Eleanor was kind to me. To think someone in this house could do such a thing." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her untouched plate. "Kind, you say," Poirot mused, tilting his head slightly. "And yet, I understand you were her physician. A position of great trust. Nest CEPA. Tell me, what was the nature of your consultations with Lady Eleanor?" The other guests, Charles Sylvia, Colonel Hurst, and Victor Crane, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their attention now fixed on Clara Jenkins. The butler stood silently by the sideboard, his face impassive but his eyes alert. Question hung in the air, and Clara seemed to shrink beneath its weight. She suffered from insomnia," Clara said at last, her words measured. "I prescribed a mild sedative to help her sleep. Nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Nothing out of the ordinary, you say? And yet, a woman is dead, murdered in a locked room, and you, her doctor, prescribed a medication that was found in her room. A most curious coincidence. Do you not agree?" Clara's eyes widened, and she gripped the edge of the table. I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Poirot. I only did my duty as a physician." "Of course," Poirot said, raising a placating hand. "But it is the duty of Hercule Poirot to examine all possibilities. And so, I must ask, when was the last time you saw Lady Eleanor alive?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her napkin. "At dinner, like everyone else. She seemed in good spirits, though, perhaps a little distracted. After the meal, I retired to my room. I had a headache and wanted to rest." "A headache," Poirot repeated, his tone neutral, but his eyes piercing. "Most inconvenient. And you did not visit Lady Eleanor's study afterward, perhaps to check on her condition?" "No." Clara's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "I told you, I was in my room." Poirot nodded slowly, as though filing her words away for later consideration. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, and addressed the room. "Ms. Amos, I suggest we adjourn to Lady Eleanor's room. There are certain details I wish to examine. Dr. Fielding, perhaps you will accompany me. Your medical expertise may prove invaluable." Clara's face paled further, but she nodded. Rising stiffly, the other guests exchanged glances, their curiosity tinged with apprehension, and followed Poirot as he led the way up the grand staircase to the second floor. The manor's corridors were lined with portraits of stern-faced blackthorns, their eyes seeming to follow the procession as it passed. The air grew colder as they approached Eleanor's private quarters. A heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Inside the room was a study in opulence, a four-poster bed draped in crimson silk, a mahogany writing desk, and a large window overlooking the misty Devonshire moors. Poirot's gaze swept the space, lingering on the bedside table where a small amber bottle sat, its label reading sedative, Dr. C. Fielding. He picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. "This is the sedative you prescribed, Dr. Fielding?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. Clara nodded, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Yes, it's a standard preparation, perfectly safe in small doses." "And how much did you dispense to Lady Eleanor?" Poirot asked, turning the bottle over in his hands. "A small amount," Clara replied, her voice faltering. "Enough for a week, no more. I gave her precise instructions to drops in water before bed." Poirot unscrewed the cap and sniffed the contents, his brow furrowing. "Curious," he murmured. "The bottle is half empty. Far more than a week's dose has been used. Would you not agree?" Clara's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "That's impossible. I only gave her a small amount. Someone must have tampered with it." "Tampered," Poirot repeated, his voice soft but laden with meaning. "A most interesting word, Dr. Fielding. And who, pray, would have access to this bottle? I don't know," Clara stammered. "It was in her room. Anyone could have." "Anyone," Poirot interrupted, his tone sharpening. "But you, as her physician, would know the contents of this bottle better than anyone, Nan. You would know, for example, that a sedative could be enhanced, shall we say, with a substance less benign." The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's implication settling over the guests like a fog. Sylvia let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, while Charles's jaw tightened. Colonel Hurst cleared his throat, and Victor Crane's eyes narrowed, as though calculating something. "I would never harm her," Clara protested, her voice rising. "I'm a doctor, Mr. Poirot. My job is to save lives, not take them. And yet," Poirot said, moving to a small leather case on the dresser Clara's medical bag, "perhaps we should examine your tools, Dr. Fielding, to ensure there is no misunderstanding." Clara froze as Poirot opened the bag, his nimble fingers sifting through its contents. A stethoscope, bandages, a syringe, and several small vials. He paused, holding up a glass vial, identical in size to the sedative bottle. Its label was blank, but a faint residue clung to the inside. "What is this, Dr. Fielding?" Poirot asked, his voice dangerously soft. Clara's breath hitched. "I don't know. It's not mine. Someone must have placed it there." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Not yours, you say? And yet, it is in your bag. Most curious." He turned to Jenkins, who had followed them into the room. "Monsieur Jenkins, would you be so kind as to fetch my portable chemical kit from my valise?" I believe a small test is in order." The butler nodded and departed, leaving the room in tense silence. Poirot placed the vial and the sedative bottle side by side on the desk, his movements precise. When Jenkins returned with the kit, a compact case filled with test tubes and reagents, Poirot set to work, his hands moving with the precision of a watchmaker. He mixed a few drops from the sedative bottle with a reagent, then did the same with the residue from the blank vial. Within moments, both samples turned a faint, unmistakable violet. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing. "An alkaloid. A most deadly one, capable of stopping the heart in minutes, and undetectable without such a test. Tell me, Dr. Fielding, how does such a substance come to be in your possession?" Clara's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. "I swear, Mr. Poirot, I didn't know. I keep alkaloids in my bag for medical purposes, small amounts, carefully controlled. Someone must have taken it, mixed it with the sedative. I'm being framed." "Framed," Poirot echoed, his tone neutral, but his mind clearly racing. "A convenient explanation, but one that requires proof. Tell me, who else had access to your bag?" Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's kept in my room, but I don't always lock it. Anyone could have gotten in. I was careless, I admit, but I didn't do this." Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Carelessness in a physician is a grave matter, Dr. Fielding. But let us assume, for now, that you speak the truth. If someone used your expertise to poison Lady Eleanor, they did so with great cunning. The dagger in her chest, I suspect, was a flourish, a distraction to mask the true cause of death." The guests gasped, and Charles leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Are you saying she was poisoned before she was stabbed?" "Precisement," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "The poison was administered through the sedative, likely hours before the dagger was used. The murderer wished to confuse the timeline, to make us believe the death was instantaneous. But Hercule Poirot is not so easily deceived." He turned back to Clara, his expression stern. "Dr. Fielding, I must ask you to be entirely frank. Did you notice anything unusual about Lady Eleanor's behavior in the days leading up to her death? Any symptoms beyond insomnia?" Clara hesitated, wiping her eyes. She mentioned feeling dizzy a few times, and her hands trembled slightly. "I thought it was fatigue, or perhaps stress about the will. I didn't think to check for poisoning. I should have." Chapter 6. The nephew's gambit. The morning mist clung to Blackthorn Manor like a shroud, curling around the ivy-clad towers and seeping into the very stones of the estate. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, stood in the grand hall, his sharp eyes scanning the portraits of long-dead blackthorns that lined the walls. Their stern faces seemed to watch him, as if guarding secrets of their own. The events of the previous night, Eleanor's murder, the hidden passage, the vial of poison, had set his mind ablaze with possibilities. Yet, it was the behavior of Charles Blackthorn, Lady Eleanor's nephew and presumed heir, that now drew his focus. The young man's cool demeanor and vague answers during questioning hinted at a deeper game, one Poirot was determined to unravel. Poirot's polished shoes clicked softly on the marble floor as he made his way to the breakfast room. The guests were already gathered, their faces a study in tension. Charles sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his eyes darting to the door as Poirot entered. Sylvia, the vivacious ward, toyed with her teaspoon, her usual sparkle dimmed. Colonel Hurst, his mustache bristling, buttered his toast with military precision, while Dr. Clara Fielding stared into her coffee, her fingers trembling slightly. Victor Crane, the novelist, was absent, likely scribbling in his room, or so he claimed. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and Poirot relished the challenge of piercing the fog of deceit. "Bonjour, Mies, Amos," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence like a well-aimed dart. "I trust you have all slept, though perhaps not soundly, Nan. A murder in the house does tend to disturb the repose." Charles gave a tight smile. "Hardly a restful night, Monsieur Poirot. But I'm sure you'll have this sorted before luncheon." Poirot's mustache twitched. "One does not rush the little grey cells, Monsieur Blackthorn." They work at their own pace, but they never fail. The butler, Jenkins, entered with a fresh pot of tea, his face as impassive as ever. Poirot noted the man's steady hands too. Steady, perhaps, for one who had witnessed a cloaked figure skulking about the manor. Jenkins had become a figure of interest, but for now, Poirot's attention was fixed on Charles. The nephew's financial troubles, hinted at by a passing remark from Sylvia the previous day, suggested a motive as old as time: greed. If Eleanor had indeed threatened to alter her will, Charles stood to lose a fortune. But was he clever enough to orchestrate a murder so intricate? After breakfast, Poirot requested a private word with Charles in the library. The room was a cavern of oak shelves and leather-bound tomes, its air heavy with the scent of old paper. Charles leaned against a table, his arms crossed, his expression one of studied nonchalance. "Monsieur Blackthorne," Poirot began, pacing slowly, "you are, I understand, the principal heir to Lady Eleanor's estate. This places you in a position most delicate, does it not? A fortune is a powerful motivator, and yet you seem remarkably untroubled by your aunt's demise." Charles's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "I loved my aunt, Monsieur Poirot, but I'm not one for theatrics. Crying won't bring her back, and I've never been good at pretending." "Precisement," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "But let us speak of realities. I have learned, through certain discreet inquiries, that you owe a considerable sum to creditors in London, a sum, perhaps, that Lady Eleanor was unwilling to cover." Charles's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. "My finances are my own business. Aunt Eleanor was generous, but she didn't throw money at every whim. We had words about it, yes, but that's hardly a motive for murder." Poirot raised a hand, as if to calm a skittish horse. "Words, monsieur, can be as deadly as daggers. I have heard from the staff that you and Lady Eleanor argued fiercely the night before her death. A witness claims she threatened to cut you from her will entirely. Is this true?" Charles hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. "She was upset, said I'd been reckless with my investments. She mentioned the will, but it was just talk. She'd never have gone through with it." Poirot's gaze sharpened, "And yet, the will is missing, burned to ashes in her study. Curious, Nan. If you were so certain of her affection, why the need to destroy it?" "I didn't." Charles snapped, his composure slipping. "I was in the billiard room all evening, as I told you. Ask Jenkins, ask anyone." Poirot nodded, as if conceding the point, but his mind was elsewhere. The billiard room alibi had already proven shaky during his reenactment of the night's movements. Charles could have slipped upstairs via a servant's staircase, unnoticed in the bustle of the gala. But motive and opportunity were not enough. Poirot needed evidence, something tangible to tie Charles to the crime, leaving Charles to stew. Poirot made his way to the nephew's room on the second floor. The chamber was a study in masculine elegance, mahogany furniture, hunting prints, a decanter of brandy on the sideboard. Poirot's eyes swept the room, methodical and unhurried. He examined the wardrobe, the desk, the bedside table, his gloved fingers probing for secrets. In the desk drawer, beneath a stack of racing forms, he found it, a folded telegram, its edges worn from handling. The message was brief but intriguing. "Meet me midnight, Garden Folly. Bring the list." J. Poirot's mustache quivered with satisfaction. A coded message, perhaps, or an appointment with an accomplice. The signature. J. could point to Jenkins, but the butler's loyalty to Eleanor seemed unshakable. More likely, it was another player in this intricate game. Poirot pocketed the telegram, intending to decode it later, and continued his search. In a velvet-lined box on the dresser, he found a collection of pawn tickets of evidence of Charles's debts, each one a noose tightening around his neck as evening approached. Poirot devised a plan to test the telegram's significance. The Garden Folly, a crumbling stone structure overgrown with roses, stood at the edge of the manor's grounds, a perfect spot for a clandestine meeting. If Charles was involved in something nefarious, he might return to the Folly, especially if he suspected Poirot was closing in. The detective enlisted Jenkins, whose knowledge of the estate's layout was invaluable, to keep watch from a distance. Poirot himself took up position behind a yew hedge, his black overcoat blending with the shadows. The night was cold, the stars obscured by clouds. At precisely midnight, Poirot heard the crunch of gravel. Charles emerged from the manor, his silhouette unmistakable in the faint glow of a lantern. He moved with purpose, glancing over his shoulder as he approached the folly. Poirot's heart quickened not from fear, but from the thrill of the hunt. Another figure appeared, cloaked and hooded, moving swiftly from the direction of the old chapel. The two met in the folly's shadow, their voices low but urgent. "You're late," Charles hissed. "Did you bring it?" The cloaked figure muttered something inaudible, handing over a small object. Poirot strained to see, but the darkness was too thick. Then, a sudden movement, the cloaked figure bolted, dropping something that glinted. In the lantern's light, Charles cursed and gave chase, but the figure vanished into the woods. Poirot waited until Charles retreated to the manor before emerging to inspect the dropped item. It was a locket, silver and heart-shaped, with a delicate engraving of a rose. Inside, a miniature portrait of Sylvia stared back at him. Poirot's mind raced. Sylvia, the ward, implicated in Charles's scheme. Or was the locket a plant, meant to mislead? He recalled the torn silk thread from her gown, found near the study. Her alibi, too, was tied to the library, with its hidden passage to a death chamber. Yet, her grief had seemed genuine, her fear of disinheritance palpable. Poirot tucked the locket into his pocket, determined to confront Sylvia next. Returning to the manor, Poirot sought out the drawing room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. He sat at a small writing desk, spreading out the telegram and a codebook he carried for such occasions. The message, he deduced, was written in a simple substitution cipher, one he had encountered in a previous case involving a smuggling ring. After several minutes of careful work, the code unraveled. "Meet me midnight, Garden Folly. Bring the list of artifacts. J. Artifacts." Poirot's brow furrowed. Blackthorn Manor was renowned for its collection of antiquities, Etruscan vases, medieval tapestries, a jade statuette said to be cursed. Had Charles planned to sell these treasures to settle his debts? The signature J remained a mystery, but Poirot suspected it was not Jenkins. The butler's devotion to Eleanor suggested he would not conspire against her. Another J, then, or a false initial meant to obscure the sender's identity. The next morning, Poirot summoned Charles to the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with exotic plants. The nephew arrived, his eyes bloodshot, as if he had not slept. Poirot held up the telegram, watching Charles's face for a reaction. "Monsieur Blackthorn, you have been most enterprising," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. "A midnight rendezvous, a list of artifacts, a mysterious J. Tell me, what was your plan?" "To plunder the manor's treasures before your aunt could disinherit you." Charles paled, his hands clenching. "You've got it wrong, Poirot. I was trying to save the estate, not rob it. Aunt Eleanor's finances were a mess-bad investments, shady deals. I was meeting a broker to sell a few pieces, just enough to keep the creditors at bay. She knew about it, approved it even." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet, you did not mention this to me. Nor did you mention the cloaked figure, who dropped a locket belonging to Mademoiselle Sylvia. An oversight, perhaps." Charles's mouth opened, then closed. "Sylvia, that's impossible. She wasn't there. I don't know who that was, but it wasn't her. The locket must be a coincidence." Poirot smiled thinly. "In my experience, monsieur, coincidences are as rare as honest men in a den of thieves. We shall see what Mademoiselle Sylvia has to say." Leaving Charles, Poirot reflected on the locket's significance. If Sylvia was not the cloaked figure, someone was using her possessions to cast suspicion. The murderer, perhaps, was weaving a web of misdirection, knowing Poirot's keen eye would follow every thread. But the telegram's reference to artifacts suggested a financial motive, one that aligned with Charles's debts but did not yet prove his guilt. The alkaloid in sedative, the hidden passage, the burned will-law, pointed to a killer with intimate knowledge of the manor and its secrets. Charles was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. As Poirot returned to the library to continue his inquiries, He paused at the hidden passage's entrance. The mechanism, a cleverly disguised lever behind a false book, was oiled and well-maintained, suggesting frequent use. Someone in the manor, perhaps. The killer had made a habit of moving unseen. Poirot's thoughts turned to the other guests. Clara's forged prescription, Hurst's cufflink, Crane's cryptic payment soul were threads in the tapestry, but none yet formed a complete image. The day unfolded with further interviews, each guest revealing fragments of truth. Jenkins, questioned again, admitted to overhearing Charles and Eleanor's argument, but swore he knew nothing of artifacts or telegrams. Colonel Hurst, when pressed about the chapel, grew defensive, insisting his visits were for quiet reflection. Clara, still shaken, produced her medical bag, now missing the alkaloid vial Poirot had seen earlier. Victor Crane, tracked down in his room, was evasive about his memoir research, claiming it was purely historical. By evening, Poirot's mind was a whirl of clues and contradictions. The locket, the telegram, the passage all pointed to a conspiracy, but the killer's identity remained elusive. He decided to stage a small experiment. At dinner, he announced casually that he had found a most curious item in the garden, watching the guests' reactions. Charles's fork paused midair. Sylvia's eyes widened, and Crane's hand tightened on his wineglass. Hurst and Clara exchanged glances, but Jenkins remained impassive. The killer, Poirot knew, was among them, and the net was tightening as the guests retired. Poirot lingered in the drawing room, sketching a timeline on a notepad. The murder had occurred at dusk, the cloaked figure seen shortly before. The passage allowed access to the study, the alkaloid suggested premeditation, and the dagger was a flourish meant to mislead. Charles's financial motive was strong, but his actions in the garden suggested he was a pawn, not a mastermind. The locket implicated Sylvia, yet her fear seemed genuine. The truth, Poirot sensed, lay in the interplay of motives, greed, fear, betrayal, all woven into the fabric of Blackthorn Manor. Satisfying end. Poirot decodes the telegram, revealing Charles' plan to sell manor artifacts to settle debts, but it doesn't directly tie him to the murder. The locket's discovery raises questions about Sylvia's role, but Poirot's instincts tell him the killer is playing a deeper game, using Charles as a distraction. The investigation continues, with Poirot determined to unmask the cloaked figure and uncover the truth behind Eleanor's death. Chapter 7. Sylvia's Masquerade, the morning after Charles's clandestine meeting in the garden. Blackthorn Manor seemed to hold its breath. The mist that clung to the Devonshire hills had thickened, shrouding the estate in a veil of grey that mirrored the unease among its inhabitants. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, stood in the grand hall, his sharp eyes scanning the ornate ceiling as if it might whisper secrets. His mind, however, was fixed on Sylvia Marlowe, the vivacious young ward of the late Lady Eleanor Blackthorn, whose theatrical displays of grief had begun to fray at the edges. Sylvia had been a puzzle from the moment Poirot arrived. Her beauty was undeniable: golden curls, emerald eyes, and a smile that could charm a statue, but her emotion seemed to shift like the wind. One moment, she was a grieving ingenue, clutching a handkerchief as tears streamed down her face. The next she was laughing with a guest, her voice bright and unburdened. Poirot, who trusted the consistency of human nature above all, found such volatility suspect. The torn silk thread found near Eleanor's study, matching Sylvia's emerald gown, had only deepened his curiosity. Was she a victim of circumstance, or a player in a more dangerous game? Poirot began his day with a walk through the manor's sprawling corridors, his polished shoes clicking against the polished oak floors. The hidden passage he had discovered behind the library bookshelf weighed heavily on his thoughts. It was a narrow, cobweb-laden tunnel, its walls damp with age, leading directly to Eleanor's locked study. The passage explained how the murderer could have bypassed the sealed windows and door, but it also implicated Sylvia, who had been in the library during the critical hour of dusk. Poirot's little grey cells buzzed with possibilities, but he needed evidence to transform suspicion into certainty. He found Sylvia in the morning room, seated by a window overlooking the fog-draped gardens. She wore a simple muslin dress, her hair loosely pinned, as if she had dressed in haste. A cup of tea sat untouched before her, steam curling into the air. She glanced up as Poirot entered, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice soft but tinged with caution. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." "It is not sleep that eludes Poirot," he replied, adjusting his cuffs. "It is the truth. And I find, Mademoiselle Sylvia, that the truth is often most forthcoming in the quiet hours of the morning." Her smile faltered, but she gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. I suppose you're here too. Ask me about everything." Poirot sat, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate precision. "Everything. Oui, but let us begin with something specific. The silk thread, mademoiselle. It was found near the study where Lady Eleanor met her unfortunate end. A thread that matches your gown from the night of the gala. Perhaps you can explain." Sylvia's hand tightened around her teaspoon, though her face remained composed. "I told you, I was in the library that evening, reading. I must have brushed against something and torn my dress. It's a large house, Monsieur Poirot. Threads get caught, indeed," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. "But the library, it is not so far from the study, is it?" And now, Poirot learns of a passage, a secret, way connecting the two. A curious coincidence, Nan. Sylvia's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze. "Are you accusing me of something, Monsieur Poirot? I loved Eleanor. She was like a mother to me. Why would I harm her?" Poirot leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "Love, mademoiselle, is a powerful motive, for good or for ill. And Poirot has learned that love, like grief, can be a performance. Tell me, why were you in Lady Eleanor's room last night, searching through her papers?" Sylvia froze, her teaspoon clattering against the saucer. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of denial, but Poirot's steady gaze held her like a vice. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "You saw me, didn't you? I should have known you'd be watching." "Poirot watches always," he said simply. "Now, speak." She hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't stealing, if that's what you think. I was looking for something Eleanor promised me. A document that would change everything." Poirot tilted his head, intrigued. "A document? Be precise, mademoiselle." Sylvia glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone, then spoke in a rush. "Eleanor wasn't just my guardian. She was my mother. My real mother. I'm not her ward, Monsieur Poirot. I'm her illegitimate daughter." The revelation hung in the air, heavy as the fog outside. Poirot's expression remained impassive, though his mind raced. "This is a grave claim, mademoiselle. You have proof." "Not yet," Sylvia admitted, her voice trembling. "Eleanor told me the truth a month ago. She said she'd hidden my birth certificate in her safe, behind a painting in her room. She was going to acknowledge me in her new will, make me her heir. But now she's dead, and the will is gone, and I panicked. I thought if I could find the certificate, I could prove who I am." Poirot stroked his mustache, considering her words. The story was plausible, but plausibility was not truth. "And why did you not tell Poirot this before?" Sylvia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I was afraid. Everyone here, Charles, Colonel Hurst, even Dr. Fielding, they all expect to gain something from Eleanor's estate. If they knew I was her daughter, they might. I don't know. I didn't want to be next." Poirot nodded, his mind cataloguing her words. Fear could explain her secrecy, but it could also mask a deeper deception. "Very well, mademoiselle. Let us see this safe." They moved to Eleanor's bedroom, a cavernous space, adorned with velvet drapes and mahogany furniture. Sylvia pointed to a portrait of a stern-faced Blackthorn ancestor hanging above the fireplace. Poirot, with the butler Jenkins's assistance, removed the painting, revealing a small wall safe. Using a combination Sylvia provided, Leonore's birthdate, the safe clicked open. Inside was a single document, yellowed with age but intact. A birth certificate naming Sylvia Eleanor Marlowe, daughter of Eleanor Blackthorn, and an unnamed father. Poirot examined the document, noting the official seal and the date, which aligned with Sylvia's age. "This appears genuine," he said. handing it back to her. "But tell me, mademoiselle, who else knew of this?" "No one," Sylvia insisted. "Eleanor swore me to secrecy. She said it would cause a scandal if it came out before she could rewrite the will. And yet," Poirot said, his voice sharp, "someone burned that will. Someone who perhaps knew its contents and wished to prevent you from inheriting." Sylvia clutched the certificate to her chest, her eyes wide. "You think that's why she was killed? Because of me?" Poirot did not answer directly. Instead, he turned to the safe, inspecting its interior. His fingers brushed against a small folded piece of paper tucked in a corner. Unfolding it, he found a handwritten note in Eleanor's elegant script. "To my daughter, Sylvia, with love. Forgive me for the years of silence." The note was a confirmation, but it also raised questions. If Eleanor intended to acknowledge Sylvia, why keep the certificate hidden? And who else might have known the truth? Poirot's thoughts turned to Victor Crane, the novelist whose initials had appeared in the chapel ledger. His research into Eleanor's family history might have uncovered Sylvia's secret, giving him leverage or a motive, leaving Sylvia with instructions to guard the certificate. Poirot sought out Crane. He found the novelist in the conservatory, scribbling in a notebook amidst a jungle of ferns and orchids. Crane looked up, his lean face guarded. "Monsieur Poirot, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Poirot wasted no time. "Monsieur Crane, you have been less than forthcoming. The ledger in the chapel lists payments to VC, your initials. Lady Eleanor paid you to research her family. But perhaps you found more than she intended. Perhaps you found a secret worth killing for." Crane's pen paused, but his expression remained cool. "You're fishing, Poirot." "Yes, Eleanor paid me to dig into her family's past. She wanted a memoir, something to cement her legacy. I found nothing worth killing over just old business dealings and a few scandals she'd already buried." And yet Poirot said, stepping closer, "You urged Mademoiselle Sylvia to reveal a certain truth to Lady Eleanor, a truth about her parentage. How did you know?" Crane's composure cracked, his eyes darting to the side. "Sylvia told you that, did she? Look, I suspected she wasn't just a ward. The way Eleanor spoke about her, the way she looked at her, it was obvious to anyone with eyes. I encouraged Sylvia to confront Eleanor, to get the truth out. Eleanor was receptive, said she'd make things right. That's all I know." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And this truth, did it find its way into your memoir draft? A draft that might have exposed secrets Lady Eleanor wished to keep buried?" Crane slammed his notebook shut. "I'm a writer, not a murderer. If you're accusing me, prove it." "I intend to," Poirot said calmly. "But first, a small matter. The torn silk thread near the study. Did you see Mademoiselle Sylvia there that night?" Crane hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I was in my room, writing. I didn't see anyone near the study." Poirot nodded, dismissing Crane for now. The novelist's denial was expected, but his knowledge of Sylvia's parentage was a thread worth pulling. Returning to his room, Poirot reviewed his notes, sketching a mental map of the manor's secrets. The hidden passage, the burned will, the forged prescription, the cloaked figure. Sylvia's birth certificate eliminated her as a suspected motive to kill. Eleanor was non-existent if she stood to inherit, but it pointed to someone who feared her inheritance. The day wore on, and Poirot's investigation took him to the library, where he examined the hidden passage more closely. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, and its walls bore scratch marks, as if someone had moved through in haste. At the study's end, he found a faint smudge of ink on the doorframe, invisible to the casual eye. Testing it with a handkerchief, he confirmed it was fresh, likely from a typewriter ribbon. Crane, the writer, was never far from his typewriter. Clue worth noting. Dinner that evening was a tense affair, the guests avoiding each other's eyes as Jenkins served a somber meal of roast pheasant. Sylvia sat quietly, the birth certificate tucked safely in her room. Charles, still shaken from Poirot's questioning, drank heavily. While Colonel Hurst grumbled about the weather, Dr. Fielding, her nerves frayed, excused herself early. Crane, however, watched Poirot with a calculating gaze. as if measuring his opponent. After dinner, Poirot requested a private word with Jenkins, the butler, who had served the Blackthorne family for decades. In the pantry, surrounded by gleaming silver, Poirot probed the old man's memory. "You saw the cloaked figure near the study." "Oui. But tell me, Jenkins, have you seen such a figure before, perhaps in the days leading to Lady Eleanor's death?" Jenkins's hands trembled as he polished a spoon. "Yes, sir, twice, maybe 3 times, always at dusk. Near the chapel, like I told you. I thought it was a poacher at first, but it moved too deliberately, like it knew the grounds." "And this figure," Poirot pressed, "did it resemble anyone here? Monsieur Crane, perhaps?" Jenkins shook his head. "Couldn't say, sir." The hood hid their face, but it was tall, like Mr. Crane, or the Colonel. Poirot thanked Jenkins, and returned to his room, his mind racing. The cloaked figure was a deliberate misdirection, he was certain, designed to confuse alibis and cast suspicion. But Crane's knowledge of Sylvia's secret, combined with the ink smudge and his typewriter, made him a compelling suspect. Yet Poirot sensed the truth lay deeper, in the tangle of motives and secrets that bound the guests to Eleanor's death. As night fell, Poirot sat by his window, the fog pressing against the glass. He opened his notebook, adding Sylvia's revelation to his list of clues. The birth certificate was a turning point, clearing Sylvia, but tightening the noose around another. Crane's role was murky as memoir, his payments, his urging of Sylvia to confront Eleanor. Was he a pawn, or the mastermind? Poirot closed his eyes, letting his little gray cells sift through the chaos. The truth was close, but it required one final piece to snap into place. The next morning, Poirot resolved to search Crane's room while the novelist was at breakfast. Slipping inside, he found a cluttered desk covered in papers, a typewriter, and a locked drawer. With a hairpin borrowed from Sylvia, Poirot picked the lock, a skill he rarely admitted to possessing. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with twine. One caught his eye. A love letter from Crane to Sylvia, dated weeks before, professing his devotion and urging her to claim her birthright. The letter was heartfelt, but its tone carried a subtle manipulation, as if Crane saw Sylvia's inheritance as his own ticket to wealth. Poirot pocketed the letter, intending to confront Crane later. As he left the room, he nearly collided with Sylvia, who stood in the hallway, her face pale. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something," she whispered, holding out a small key. It was in Eleanor's jewelry box, hidden under a false bottom. "I think it's for something important." Poirot examined the key, its intricate design suggesting it belonged to a private lockbox or cabinet. "You have done well, mademoiselle. This key may unlock more than a box. It may unlock the truth." Together, they searched Eleanor's study, testing the key on every drawer and cabinet. It fit none until Poirot noticed a small, ornate box on a high shelf, disguised as a decorative book. The key turned smoothly, revealing a velvet-lined interior containing a single item, a diamond-encrusted locket, identical to the one dropped in the garden during Charles's meeting. Inside was a miniature portrait of Sylvia as a child, confirming Eleanor's maternal bond. "This locket," Poirot said, holding it up, "is a symbol of truth, but also of danger. Someone else knew of your parentage, mademoiselle, and sought to use it." Sylvia's eyes widened. "Crane, he wrote to me, said he loved me, but I didn't trust him. He kept pushing me to tell Eleanor, to demand my place." Poirot nodded, his suspicions hardening. "Monsieur Crane is a man of ambition, and ambition can lead to desperate acts. But we must be certain." The day unfolded with Poirot, shadowing Crane, observing his interactions. The novelist was charming but evasive, deflecting questions about his memoir with vague answers. At one point, Poirot caught him slipping a note to Charles, who pocketed it quickly. Intercepting Charles later, Poirot demanded to see the note. It read, "Meet me tonight, same place." We finished this. The garden meeting, it seemed, was not a one-time affair. Poirot resolved to stake out the garden again, this time with Sylvia as a witness. As midnight approached, they hid behind a row of yew hedges, the fog muffling their breaths. Crane appeared first, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Charles joined him, their voices low but urgent. "You promised me half," Charles hissed. "If Sylvia gets the estate, we're ruined." "Patience," Crane replied. "The certificate is safe for now, but we need to deal with Poirot. He's too close." Poirot's heart quickened. The certificate, Crane knew of it, and his alliance with Charles suggested a conspiracy. But before he could act, a twig snapped. Under Sylvia's foot, Crane spun around, his eyes searching the darkness. "Who's there?" he called. Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "It is I, Hercule Poirot, and I have heard enough, Monsieur Crane." Crane's face paled, but he recovered quickly. "You're mistaken, Poirot. Charles and I were discussing business, nothing more." "Business that involves a birth certificate and a murder," Poirot said, producing the love letter. "This letter, monsieur, reveals your true intentions. You sought to control Mademoiselle Sylvia, to use her inheritance for your own gain. And when Lady Eleanor threatened to expose your memoir, you ensured her silence." Charles backed away, his hands raised. "I had no part in murder, Poirot. Crane said he'd handle everything." Sylvia gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Crane's eyes darted between them, calculating his escape. But Poirot was relentless. "The ink on the hidden passage, monsieur. The typewriter ribbon matching the forged prescription. The locket dropped in the garden. You wove a clever web, but Poirot sees through it." Crane sneered, his charm dissolving. "You have no proof. A letter, a locket circumstantial at best." "Perhaps," Poirot said, "but the truth is in the details, and Poirot is a master of details." The confrontation ended with Crane retreating to his room, but Poirot knew. The net was tightening. He escorted Sylvia back to the manor, assuring her safety. The birth certificate and locket were secure, and Crane's alliance with Charles was exposed. The next step was to verify the typewriter evidence and confront Crane with the full weight of his deception. As Poirot retired for the night, he felt the pieces falling into place. Sylvia's masquerade, her grief, her secrecy was genuine, born of fear and hope. Crane, however, was a different kind of actor, one whose performance hid a dangerous ambition. The final act was near, and Poirot would ensure the curtain fell on the guilty. The fog outside thickened, but within Blackthorn Manor, the truth was beginning to shine through. Chapter 8. The Colonel's burden, the morning mist, clung to Blackthorn Manor like a shroud, its tendrils curling around the ivy-clad towers as Hercule Poirot stood at the edge of the terrace, his sharp eyes scanning the frost-kissed lawns. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimneys, and the manor seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the secrets it harbored. Poirot's gloved hands rested lightly on the stone balustrade, his mind a whirl of deductions. Each clue a thread in the intricate tapestry of Lady Eleanor Blackthorn's murder. The jeweled dagger, the burned will, the hidden passage, the poison-laced sedative, all pointed to a killer who thrived on misdirection. Yet it was the discovery of Colonel Reginald Hurst's engraved cufflink in the old chapel, coupled with his gruff demeanor and evasive answers, that now drew Poirot's attention like a moth to a flame. Hurst had been a presence at the manor since Poirot's arrival, his military bearing and clipped speech marking him as a man of discipline. Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease whenever Eleanor's death was mentioned. The cufflink, found in the dust of the chapel floor, was no mere trinket, bore the initials R.H. in ornate script, a detail too precise to be coincidence. Poirot had also learned from Jenkins, the butler, that Hurst had been seen near the chapel at dusk, cloaked in a manner that suggested secrecy. The cryptic note in Eleanor's hand, "Beware the shadow at dusk," seemed to point directly to him. But Poirot, ever cautious, knew that the obvious suspect was rarely the true culprit. He needed to unravel Hurst's story, to peel back the layers of his past and discover what tethered him to Eleanor's fate. Poirot found the Colonel in the conservatory, a glass-domed haven filled with exotic ferns and the faint hum of a radiator. Hurst sat on a wicker chair, a cigar smoldering in an ashtray beside him, his weathered hands clasped tightly as he stared at a potted orchid. His face, lined with years of service and perhaps regret, turned toward Poirot as the detective approached, his mustache bristling with a forced smile. "Good morning, Colonel Hurst," Poirot said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "I trust you slept well, despite the disturbances of this house." Hurst's smile faded, replaced by a guarded frown. "Slept as well as one can with a murderer on the loose, Poirot. What do you want? More questions, I presume. Maze." "Oui," Poirot replied, settling into a chair opposite the colonel. The mind of Hercule Poirot is never at rest, particularly when there are inconsistencies to resolve. "Tell me, Colonel, what brought you to the chapel yesterday evening, and why does your cufflink now reside in my pocket?" Hurst's hand twitched, as if resisting the urge to check his sleeve. His eyes narrowed, but he maintained his composure. "Chapel? I don't know what you're talking about. I was on the terrace all evening, smoking. Jenkins can vouch for that." "Jenkins," Poirot said, tilting his head, "is a most observant butler, but his eyes cannot be everywhere. He saw a figure in a cloak near the chapel at dusk, a figure that matches your description. And this cufflink," Poirot produced the small silver item, its engraving glinting in the conservatory's soft light, "was found where you stood. A curious coincidence, Nan." Hurst's jaw tightened, and for a moment Poirot thought he might deny it outright. But the colonel exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if the weight of years pressed upon him. "Very well, Poirot. I was in the chapel, but it's not what you think. I wasn't there to kill Eleanor. I was looking for something. Something." Poirot's eyebrows arched. "You will forgive me, Colonel, but in a house where a woman has been murdered, something is not a sufficient answer. What were you seeking, and why in the chapel?" Hurst stubbed out his cigar with more force than necessary, the ash crumbling into the tray. "It's a long story, Poirot, and not a pleasant one. Eleanor and I, we go back years. Before you judge me, understand that I owed her a great deal. But she wasn't the saint everyone thought." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Continue, mon ami. The past, it has a way of illuminating the present." Hurst's voice dropped, as if wary of the conservatory's glass walls. 30 years ago, I was court-martialed. Embezzlement, they called it, though it was a misunderstanding. A junior officer's mistake, I took the blame for. My career was ruined, my name dragged through the mud. Eleanor, God rest her, was a friend of my late wife. She pulled strings, used her influence to hush it up, kept it out of the papers. But there was a price. A price. Poirot prompted, his fingers steepled. "She wanted my silence," Hurst said bitterly. The Blackthorne family wasn't as pristine as their title suggested. Shady investments, deals with unsavory types arms, traders, mostly. Eleanor's father built the family fortune on it, and she inherited the secrets. She didn't want them exposed, especially not now, with that novelist Crane sniffing around for his blasted memoir. She asked me to keep quiet, and in return, she'd ensure my pension, my dignity. But lately, she'd been demanding more. Poirot's mind raced, connecting the threads. The ledger in the chapel, listing payments to VC, had hinted at Eleanor's financial entanglements. Victor Crane's research into the family's history was no mere literary pursuit, threatened to unearth a scandal. But Hurst's confession suggested a deeper motive, one tied to coercion. "And these demands," Poirot said carefully, "they made you resent her." "Resent, perhaps," Hurst admitted. "She'd call me to the chapel, always at dusk, to discuss business. Handed me envelopes of cash to keep my mouth shut. Said if I didn't, she'd let the world know about my court-martial. I went there last night to find those envelopes, to destroy any trace of our arrangement. That's when I lost the cufflink and the cloak." Poirot asked, his tone deceptively mild. "The figure Jenkins saw, it was you, was it not?" Hurst nodded, his face grim. "Yes, I didn't want to be seen. The manor's full of prying eyes. But I swear, Poirot, I didn't kill her. When I heard the scream, I was on the terrace, smoking. I ran inside with the others." Poirot's gaze drifted to the ashtray, where a pile of cigar ash sat undisturbed. It was a small detail, but one that could confirm or unravel Hurst's story. "You are a man of habits, Colonel. Tell me, how many cigars did you smoke that evening?" Hurst blinked, caught off guard. 2, maybe 3. "Why?" Poirot rose, examining the ash closely. "The ash," It is distinctive. Cuban, I presume. A strong blend, not easily mistaken. If Jenkins confirms the ash on the terrace, your alibi may hold, but if not, he let the implication hang, watching Hurst's reaction. The colonel's face remained steady, but a bead of sweat traced his temple. Check the terrace, Poirot. You'll find it. Poirot excused himself, leaving Hurst to his thoughts, and made his way to the terrace. The stone flags were dusted with frost, but near the balustrade, he found what he sought, a small pile of cigar ash, identical to that in the conservatory. Jenkins, summoned to verify, nodded. I swept the terrace that morning, sir. Any ash there would be from that evening. Satisfied, Poirot returned to the Manor's library, where he spread out his notes, the clues forming a mosaic in his mind. Hurst's alibi held, for now, but his confession revealed a critical piece of the puzzle: Eleanor's blackmail, her control over Hurst, her payments to Crane. Her threat to rewrite the will all pointed to a woman guarding secrets that others would kill to protect. The ledger in the chapel, with its cryptic entries, suggested a financial trail that linked Eleanor to Crane's research, but also, perhaps, to another guest. Poirot summoned Sylvia, whose tearful confessions in the previous chapter had cleared her of direct suspicion, but left questions about her relationship with Victor Crane. She arrived in the library, her auburn hair neatly pinned, though her eyes betrayed a lingering fear. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice trembling, have you found who killed Eleanor? Not yet, mademoiselle, Poirot replied, gesturing for her to sit. But I am close. Tell me, what do you know of Eleanor's business dealings? Her investments, perhaps, or her reasons for hiring Monsieur Crane. Sylvia's hands twisted in her lap. I didn't know much. She kept her finances private. But I overheard her arguing with Victor once, about his memoir. She said it was dangerous, that it could ruin the family name. He laughed it off, said the truth would sell books. And you, mademoiselle, did you believe him? Sylvia hesitated, then shook her head. Victor's ambitious. He'd do anything for fame. But Eleanor trusted him, at least at first. She paid him to dig into the family's past, thinking it would be a legacy. Then she changed her mind, wanted it stopped. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And when did she change her mind? A week ago, Sylvia said. She told me she'd destroy the memoir's notes, burn them if she had to. That's why I was in her room. I thought I could find them, to understand what she was hiding. Poirot nodded, his mind slotting this into place. The scorched paper in the study's fireplace, the missing will, the payments to VC, all pointed to Crane's memoir as a catalyst. But the poison, the dagger, the hidden passage suggested a plan, both meticulous and theatrical, designed to confuse. Hurst's blackmail, while motive enough for anger, did not align with the murder's complexity. Crane, however, with his writer's flair and typewriter linked to the forged prescription, remained a shadow in the narrative. As evening fell, Poirot revisited the chapel, its stained glass windows casting fractured light across the pews. He examined the ledger again, noting the dates of payments to VC. They stopped abruptly a week before Eleanor's death, coinciding with Sylvia's account of Eleanor's change of heart. A new entry caught his eye, scrawled in Eleanor's hand. VC demands more. Must end this. The words were a revelation. Crane had not only been paid for silence, but had pushed for more. Perhaps threatening exposure. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a faint creak from the chapel's rear. He turned, his hand on his cane, and saw a shadow flicker behind a pillar. Who is there? He called, his voice echoing. No answer came, but a soft thud suggested something dropped. Moving swiftly, Poirot found a small notebook, its pages filled with shorthand notes, in Crane's distinctive script. Flipping through, he saw references to arms deals, Blackthorn profits, and a chilling line. Eleanor's death would free the truth. The notebook was a damning clue, but Poirot knew it was incomplete. Crane's ambition, his knowledge of Eleanor's secrets, and his access to the hidden passage made him a prime suspect, yet the poison's sophistication pointed to someone with medical knowledge. Clara Fielding, perhaps, or someone using her expertise. The cufflink, the ash, and Hurst's confession had cleared the colonel. but they opened a new question. Who else knew of Eleanor's blackmail? Poirot returned to the manor, his steps purposeful. In the drawing room, he gathered the guests. Their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. "Mies Amos," he began, his voice commanding, "the truth of Lady Eleanor's death draws near. Colonel Hurst has revealed a piece of her past, a secret she used to bind him. But there is another, one who sought to profit from her secrets, one who wove a web of deceit." Hurst shifted uncomfortably. Sylvia's eyes widened, and Crane's hand tightened on his glass. Poirot continued, "The ledger, the payments, the memoir all point to a motive rooted in ambition. But the method, the poison, the dagger, these are the work of a mind that plans, that misdirects. Tomorrow, I shall reveal all." As the guests dispersed, Poirot lingered, his gaze on the fireplace, where the memory of scorched paper lingered. Hurst's burden was real, but it was not the heart of the crime. The colonel's cigar ash had anchored his alibi, and the chapel's secrets had shifted suspicion to Crane. Yet Poirot felt the final piece lay just beyond his grasp. A shadow, at dusk, waiting to be illuminated by his little gray cells. Chapter 9. The Novelist's Deception. The morning sun filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of Blackthorn Manor, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished oak floors of the drawing-room. Hercule Poirot stood at the center, his small, immaculate figure a stark contrast to the grandeur of the room, with its towering bookshelves and ancestral portraits glaring down. His hands were clasped behind his back, his mustache perfectly symmetrical, and his eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a man who had begun to see the threads of truth weaving through the tapestry of lies. The air was thick with anticipation, for the guests of the manor knew that Poirot was closing in on the murderer of Lady Eleanor Blackthorn. The question was not if he would unmask the culprit, but when and how. Poirot had spent the previous night in restless contemplation, his little gray cells working tirelessly to align the scattered clues, the burned will, the hidden passage, the forged prescription, the smudged fingerprint, the cloaked figure at dusk. Each piece was a fragment of a larger mosaic, and now, in the pale light of morning, he felt certain that the picture was nearly complete. The novelist, Victor Crane, had emerged as a figure of particular interest. His cryptic demeanor, his connection to Eleanor's memoir, and the troubling discovery of the typewriter ribbon matching the forged prescription had elevated him from a peripheral suspect to the epicenter of Poirot's suspicions. The drawing-room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging like the inexorable march of truth. Poirot had summoned the remaining guests: Charles Blackthorn, Sylvia, Colonel Reginald Hurst, and Dr. Clara Fielding to join him, along with the butler, Jenkins, whose nervous glances betrayed his unease at being included in such a gathering. Victor Crane was conspicuously absent, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the others. "Where is Mr. Crane?" Charles asked, his voice sharp with impatience. He lounged in an armchair, one leg crossed over the other, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the armrest. "If you're to accuse someone, Poirot, let's have everyone present." Poirot raised a hand, his gesture both calming and commanding. "Patience, Monsieur Blackthorn. Monsieur Crane will join us in due time. For now, we must discuss certain irregularities that have come to my attention." Sylvia, seated on a velvet settee, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes red from sleeplessness. "Irregularities," she whispered. "You mean about Victor? Oh, surely you don't think he—" "I think, Mademoiselle Sylvia, only what the facts permit me to think," Poirot interrupted gently, though his tone carried an edge of steel. "And the facts, they are most curious indeed." Colonel Hurst, standing by the fireplace, snorted. "Facts, Poirot. You've been chasing shadows literally, with that nonsense about a cloaked figure. I told you, I was on the terrace when Eleanor was killed. You verified it yourself with that blasted cigar ash." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, Colonel, your alibi is secure. The ash from your cigar, found precisely where you said you were smoking, confirms your presence on the terrace at the time of the scream. But the cloaked figure, it is not so easily dismissed. It is, perhaps, the key to the entire affair." Dr. Clara Fielding, perched on the edge of a chair, adjusted her spectacles nervously. Monsieur Poirot, you've cleared my name regarding the forged prescription. Surely you don't think I'm still involved? Poirot's eyes softened as he regarded her. Nan, Madame Fielding. The prescription, forged in your name, was a clever ruse to cast suspicion upon you. Your innocence is not in question. But the one who forged it, that is another matter. The door creaked open, and Victor Crane entered, his tall frame slightly stooped, his dark eyes wary. He wore a tailored suit, but the cuffs were frayed, a subtle sign of financial strain that Poirot had noted earlier. Crane's expression was one of forced nonchalance, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching at his sides. You sent for me, Monsieur Poirot. Crane's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like a man accustomed to weaving stories to suit his needs. Oui, Monsieur Crane, Poirot replied, gesturing to a chair. Please, be seated. We have much to discuss. Crane hesitated, then sat, his gaze flickering to the other guests. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the very walls of Blackthorn Manor were holding their breath. Poirot began to pace, his steps measured, his voice deliberate. Let us review, Ms. Amos, the facts of this most perplexing case. Lady Eleanor Blackthorn, a woman of wealth and secrets, is found dead in her locked study, a jeweled dagger in her chest. The will she intended to rewrite is missing, burned. 2 ashes in the fireplace. A hidden key, a smudged fingerprint, a cryptic note about a shadow at dusk, a secret passage, a vial of poison. A forged prescription. All these clues, they point to a mind most cunning, a mind that seeks to obscure the truth with layers of deception. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. But Hercule Poirot, he is not so easily deceived. Let us begin with the will. Its destruction suggests the murderer had much to gain or lose by its contents. Monsieur Charles, you stood to inherit the estate, but your debts to Lady Eleanor made her threat to disinherit you most alarming. Charles bristled. I've told you, Poirot, I didn't kill her. I was in the billiard room. So you say, Poirot replied, his tone neutral. And yet, your alibi, it is not so solid as you believe. The billiard room is but a short walk from the hidden passage, which leads directly to the study. A quick step, a moment's work, and you could have returned unnoticed. Charles's face reddened, but before he could protest, Poirot turned to Sylvia. Mademoiselle Sylvia, your secret as Lady Eleanor's daughter was confirmed by the birth certificate in her safe. Your fear of disinheritance was real, but your use of the hidden passage to eavesdrop, not to kill, absolves you. Your grief, it is genuine. Sylvia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I only wanted her to love me as her daughter. Poirot's gaze shifted to Colonel Hurst. You, Colonel, carried the burden of a past scandal. One Lady Eleanor helped conceal your presence as the cloaked figure, spying on her, was an act of desperation, not murder. Your alibi, as I have said, is confirmed. Hurst grunted, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Told you, I'm no killer. Nan, Poirot agreed, but you were not entirely truthful. The cufflink in the chapel, engraved with your initials, suggests you knew more about Eleanor's secrets than you admitted. Hurst's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot's attention turned to Dr. Fielding. Madame, your expertise was exploited. The alkaloid mixed with the sedative was a clever touch, meant to confuse the cause of death. The forged prescription in your name was a cruel attempt to implicate you. But you are not the author of this crime. Clara exhaled, her hands steadying. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Finally, Poirot's eyes locked onto Victor Crane, which brings us to you, Monsieur Crane. The novelist, the man of words, the man who spins tales for a living. Your role in this affair is most illuminating. Crane's smile was thin, almost mocking. I'm flattered by your attention, Poirot, but I'm just a writer. I research, I observe, I create, I don't kill. Do you not? Poirot's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of accusation. Let us examine your story, monsieur. You were hired by Lady Eleanor to research her family's history for a memoir that uncovered unsavory truths about the Blackthorn fortune. Truths tied to illegal arms deals. She paid you handsomely to keep silent, as evidenced by the ledger in the chapel, marked with your initials VC. But you, monsieur, had other plans. You saw in this memoir a path to fame, to literary glory. When Lady Eleanor decided to halt its publication, your ambition was threatened. And ambition, it is a powerful motive. Crane's smile faltered, but he leaned back in his chair, feigning ease. A fine story, Poirot, but you have no proof. Ah, but I do, Poirot said, producing a small ribbon-like strip from his pocket. This mise Amos is a typewriter ribbon found in your room, Monsieur Crane. Its impressions match precisely the font of the forged prescription used to frame Dr. Fielding. A coincidence, Nan? I think not. The room gasped. Crane's face paled, but he recovered quickly. Anyone could have used my typewriter. It's not locked away. Perhaps, Poirot conceded, but there is more. The smudged fingerprint on the fireplace poker. The one that did not match any guest save for yours, Monsieur Crane. You attempted to obscure it, but the science, it does not lie. And then, there is the matter of the cloaked figure. Crane's eyes narrowed. You've already pinned that on Hearst. Nan, Poirot said sharply. The colonel was the cloaked figure on previous occasions, spying for his own reasons. But on the night of the murder, it was you, Monsieur Crane, who donned the cloak to create confusion, to cast doubt on the alibis of others. You admitted to seeing the cloaked figure yourself. Clever misdirection, for you could not have seen it if you were it. Crane's composure cracked, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. This is absurd. You're weaving a fiction, Poirot. Poirot stepped closer, his voice low and relentless. And the vial of alkaloid, hidden in your room, behind a loose floorboard. You used it to lace Lady Eleanor's sedative, intending to kill her quietly. The jeweled dagger, it was a flourish, a dramatic touch to mask the true method of death poison. You knew the autopsy would focus on the stabbing, delaying discovery of the alkaloid. But Hercule Poirot, he sees what others do not. The room was deathly silent. Sylvia's handkerchief fell to the floor. Charles stared, open-mouthed. Hearst's cigar trembled in his hand. Clara's eyes were wide with shock. Crane stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You have no right to accuse me without evidence. This is all conjecture. Poirot's smile was cold. Conjecture, monsieur. Then let us test it. Jenkins, if you please. The butler, trembling, stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. Poirot opened it, revealing a glass vial identical to the one found in the chapel, its contents shimmering faintly in the light. This, Poirot said, was found in your room, Monsieur Crane, after a most thorough search. It contains the same alkaloid used to poison Lady Eleanor. Shall we compare it to the residue in her sedative bottle? I think the match will be most conclusive. Crane's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. He sank back into his chair, his face ashen. You devil, he whispered. How did you know? Poirot's eyes gleamed with triumph. Hercule Poirot knows, because he observes, he thinks, he deduces. You, Monsieur Crane, underestimated the power of the little gray cells. You thought your story, your deception, would outwit us all. But the truth, it is like a mirror, it reflects what is, not what you wish it to be. Crane buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Eleanor was going to destroy everything, my work, my name. That memoir was my masterpiece, my chance to be remembered. She wanted to bury it, to protect her family's name. I couldn't let her. The confession hung in the air, heavy and final. Sylvia sobbed softly. Charles cursed under his breath. Hearst shook his head, as if unable to comprehend the betrayal. Clara remained silent, her face a mask of relief and sorrow. Poirot turned to Jenkins. Please, summon the authorities. Monsieur Crane will answer for his crimes. As Jenkins hurried from the room, Poirot addressed the others. The case, it is nearly closed. But there is one final matter. Mademoiselle Sylvia, the birth certificate confirms your place as Lady Eleanor, heir. The manor, the estate, it is yours, as she intended. Sylvia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor calm once more. "The truth, it is not always pleasant, but it is necessary. Hercule Poirot, he does not rest until it is found." The guests dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the vast halls of Blackthorn Manor. Poirot lingered, gazing out the window at the mist-shrouded grounds. The case was nearly at its end, but one final act remained, the denouement, where all would be laid bare. For now, Victor Crane's deception had been unraveled. But Poirot knew the final chapter would cement the truth in the minds of all. He turned, his mind already preparing for the gathering to come, where he would reveal not only Crane's guilt, but the intricate web of lies that had nearly concealed it. The little grey cells had triumphed, and Blackthorn Manor would soon be at peace. Chapter 10. The Final Deduction. The Grand Drawing Room of Blackthorn Manor, where the heavy velvet curtains seemed to absorb the very air. Hercule Poirot stood poised, his small, immaculate figure commanding the attention of all present. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the ornate rugs, and the guests Charles Blackthorn, Sylvia Marlowe, Colonel Reginald Hurst, Dr. Clara Fielding, and Victor Crane sat in a semicircle, their faces a gallery of unease, curiosity, and dread. The butler, Jenkins, hovered near the door, his usual stoicism frayed by the weight of the evening. Poirot's eyes, sharp and gleaming like polished jet, surveyed the room, his mustache twitching slightly as he prepared to unravel the tangled threads of Eleanor Blackthorn's murder. "Mies Amos," Poirot began, his voice soft yet resonant. "We have gathered here to bring light to the darkness that has fallen upon Blackthorn Manor. The death of Lady Eleanor Blackthorn was no accident, nor was it the work of a phantom or a thief in the night. It was a murder most calculated, most deliberate, executed with a precision that sought to confound even the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. But," he raised a finger, his gaze sweeping over the assembly, "the little grey cells, they do not fail." He paced slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his polished shoes clicking softly on the parquet floor. "Let us begin with the facts. Lady Eleanor was found dead in her locked study, a jeweled dagger plunged into her chest. The windows were sealed, the door locked from within, and the key discovered beneath her desk, suggesting tampering. The will she intended to rewrite was missing, its fragments scorched in the fireplace. A note in her hand warned of the shadow at dusk, and a smudged fingerprint on the fireplace poker hinted at an unknown presence. These are the threads we weave, but they are not the whole tapestry." The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Poirot and one another. Charles, his jaw tight, gripped the armrest of his chair. Sylvia's hands twisted a lace handkerchief. Hurst's mustache bristled as he sat ramrod straight. Clara's pale face betrayed a flicker of fear, and Crane, his novelist's poise faltering, adjusted his spectacles nervously. "First, let us consider the method of the crime," Poirot continued. "The dagger, it was dramatic, Nan, a weapon of passion, of theatricality. Yet, my friends, it was not the cause of death. The autopsy, conducted with the assistance of Dr. Fielding's expertise, revealed traces of a lethal alkaloid in Lady Eleanor's system, administered through her sedative. The dagger was a flourish, a misdirection to obscure the true method poison. The murderer wished us to believe the stabbing was the act, but it was merely the curtain falling on a play already concluded." Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "But I prescribed only a mild sedative. I told you, someone tampered with my bag." Poirot nodded, his expression one of serene assurance. "Oui, mademoiselle, and we shall return to your role in due course. For now, let us examine the motive." Lady Eleanor's announcement to rewrite her will set this tragedy in motion. The will, it seems, was the key to the murderer's heart, or rather, to their ambition. Its destruction in the fireplace suggests the killer knew its contents and sought to protect their gain or prevent their loss. But who stood to gain? Charles, the nephew, burdened by debts. Sylvia, the ward, or perhaps more than a ward. Colonel Hurst, bound by a past scandal. Dr. Fielding, with her medical knowledge, or Monsieur Crane, The novelist with secrets of his own. He paused, letting the question hang in the air like a storm cloud. The fire snapped, and Jenkins coughed discreetly, breaking the silence. "Let us walk through the night of the murder," Poirot said, resuming his pacing. "Each of you claimed an alibi. Monsieur Charles, you were in the billiard room, yet your movements were unverified for a crucial 10 minutes. Mademoiselle Sylvia, you were in the library, but a torn silk thread from your gown was found near the study. Colonel Hurst, you smoked on the terrace, yet your cufflink appeared in the chapel. Dr. Fielding, you were in your room, tending a headache, but your medical bag held the alkaloid. And Monsieur Crane, you wrote in your room, yet your initials appeared in a ledger of mysterious payments. And then, there is the cloaked figure, seen by Jenkins at dusk, near the study and the chapel. A shadow indeed." Poirot stopped, turning to face the group, his eyes narrowing. "The alibis, they are like a puzzle with pieces that do not fit until one discovers the hidden passage. Behind the library bookshelf, a narrow corridor leads directly to the study, bypassing the locked door. This mise en scène is how the murderer entered and exited, leaving the illusion of an impossible crime. But who used this passage? And why the poison, followed by the dagger?" He drew a small notebook from his pocket, flipping it open with a flourish. "Let us consider the clues. The scorched will fragments suggest its destruction was urgent. The cryptic note, 'Beware the shadow at dusk,' points to a time and a presence. The smudged fingerprint on the poker, it was no accident, it was deliberate, meant to mislead. The vial of poison in the chapel, abandoned, suggests a plan altered. And the forged prescription in Dr. Fielding's name, typed on a ribbon matching Monsieur Crane's typewriter, reveals a cunning mind at work." Crane stiffened, his hand pausing on his spectacles. "I've told you, Poirot, I had nothing to do with the murder. The typewriter ribbon proves nothing." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his voice smooth as velvet. "Patience, monsieur. All will be revealed. Let us first address the others. Monsieur Charles, your debts to Lady Eleanor were substantial, and your coded telegram arranging a midnight meeting suggests desperation. Yet, the locket dropped by your mysterious contact bore Mademoiselle Sylvia's portrait, not evidence of murder. Your crime, perhaps, was one of greed, not blood." Charles flushed, his fists clenching. "I needed money, yes, but I didn't kill her." Poirot turned to Sylvia, his expression softening. "Mademoiselle Sylvia, your secret, as Eleanor's illegitimate daughter, was a heavy burden. The silk thread placed you near the study, but your birth certificate, found in Eleanor's safe, confirms your story. You sought only acceptance, not her death. You used the passage to eavesdrop, not to kill." Sylvia's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded, clutching her handkerchief. "Colonel Hurst," Poirot continued, "your cufflink in your past with Eleanor suggested blackmail, and your cloaked wanderings near the chapel raised suspicion. Yet the ash from your cigar on the terrace confirms your alibi at the moment of the scream. You spied, but you did not strike." Hurst exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I only wanted to protect myself. She had too much power over me." Poirot's gaze shifted to Clara. "Dr. Fielding, your sedative was the vehicle for the poison, and the alkaloid in your bag cast a shadow over you. But the forged prescription, written in a hand not your own, clears you. You were a pawn, used for your expertise." Clara's lips trembled, but she managed a nod. "I swear, I only wanted to help her sleep." Poirot now turned to Victor Crane, his eyes gleaming with intensity. "Which brings us to you, Monsieur Crane, the novelist, the researcher, the man of words and secrets. Your memoir for Lady Eleanor uncovered her family's dark history of illegal arms deals that brought wealth, but shame. She paid you to keep silent, as the ledger's VC confirms. But you, monsieur, saw opportunity. You planned to publish the memoir yourself, against her wishes, to secure fame and fortune. When Eleanor announced her intent to rewrite her will, likely to cut you off, you acted." Crane's face paled, his fingers gripping his chair. "This is preposterous. You have no proof." Poirot held up a hand, silencing him. "The proof, it is in the details. The typewriter ribbon, monsieur, matches the forged prescription, exactly a font unique to your machine. The smudged fingerprint. On the poker, it was yours, deliberately obscured to suggest an outsider. The vial of alkaloid, hidden in your room, not the chapel, confirms you prepared the poison. And the cloaked figure. A fiction, a masquerade, you staged, to confuse the timeline, seen by Jenkins, but never clearly. You used the hidden passage to enter the study, administered the poison through the sedative, and, to ensure suspicion fell elsewhere, staged the dagger scene after Eleanor was already dead. The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Crane's composure crumbled, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. You can't prove any of this. It's all conjecture. Poirot smiled faintly, producing a small vial from his pocket, its glass glinting in the firelight. This, monsieur, was found beneath your floorboard, wrapped in a cloth with your initials. A chemical analysis confirms it contains the same alkaloid that killed Lady Eleanor. And your memoir draft, hidden in your typewriter case, reveals your intent to betray her trust. You saw her death as the final chapter of your rise to fame. Crane slumped, his hands covering his face. I didn't mean for it to go this far. She was going to ruin me, stop the memoir. I had to protect my work, my legacy. Poirot's expression remained impassive. Your legacy, monsieur, is one of crime. You poisoned Lady Eleanor, used the passage to stage the locked room mystery, and framed Dr. Fielding to divert suspicion. But the little gray cells, they see through the shadows. Jenkins stepped forward, his face grim. Shall the first summon the authorities, sir? Poirot nodded. We, Jenkins. Monsieur Crane will face justice. As the butler left, Sylvia rose, her voice trembling but firm. Monsieur Poirot, what of the estate? The will. Poirot turned to her, his tone gentle. The fragments of the will, though burned, were partially reconstructed. Eleanor intended to name you, Mademoiselle Sylvia, as her primary heir, acknowledging you as her daughter. The manor is yours, as is her love. Sylvia's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of relief. Charles, though pale, nodded in acceptance. Hurst and Clara exchanged glances of quiet gratitude, their own burdens lifted. Poirot adjusted. His coat, his work complete. The case, it is closed. The shadows of Blackthorn Manor are dispelled, and the truth shines clear. Hercule Poirot bids you adieu. As he stepped into the misty Devonshire night, the manor's lights glowed behind him, a beacon of peace restored. In his mind, the little gray cells hummed with satisfaction, having unraveled a crime that could have rewritten history but instead became another. Triumph of reason. The authorities arrived shortly after, their lanterns cutting through the fog. As they escorted Victor Crane away, the manor, though scarred by tragedy, stood resilient, its secrets laid bare. Sylvia, now its mistress, began the slow work of healing, guided by Eleanor's memory. Charles, chastened, vowed to reform. Hurst and Clara, freed from suspicion, found solace in their cleared names. And Poirot, boarding a train back to London, gazed out at the rolling hills, his thoughts already turning to the next puzzle that awaited his unparalleled mind.